The oracle's words were once believed to be divine, guiding emperors and kings. But what if they weren't messages from the gods at all? What if the voices they heard were not divine whispers, but carefully crafted illusions, designed to manipulate those in power? In the shadow of ancient temples, a game of control was played. A game that shaped empires, won battles, and lost kingdoms. As the line between divine will and human influence blurred, the question remains, were oracles the true voices of the gods, or were they the puppets of those who learned how to pull the strings? The ruins of ancient temples stand silently under the weight of time, their walls crumbling, their once majestic pillars now mere shadows of what they once were. Yet, amid this quiet decay, there is an unmistakable energy that lingers in the air, an invisible thread that seems to tug at the imagination. There's something hauntingly mysterious about the concept of oracles, about these ancient figures who were believed to hold the keys to the future, who whispered the secrets of the gods into the ears of kings and generals. But what if everything we've been told about these oracles is not entirely true? What if the voices they claim to hear were not divine at all, but instead carefully crafted whispers designed to manipulate, to control, to shape the course of history itself? What if the oracles were not chosen by the gods, but by human hands, trained in the art of psychological warfare? Imagine the scene. A dark chamber, lit only by the flickering light of oil lamps. A solitary figure, often a young woman, sits on a stone chair, her face pale, her eyes clouded with some unseen vision. She's the oracle, the one who will speak the will of the gods. The air in the room is thick with incense, the scent of myrrh and frankincense hanging heavy in the space, almost suffocating. The sounds of chanting, low and rhythmic, fill the air, creating an almost hypnotic atmosphere. The oracle sways slightly, her breathing slow and measured. The priestess who attends to her whispers the questions of kings, generals, and citizens into her ear. As she closes her eyes, a strange calm washes over her, and for a moment, it seems as though the world holds its breath. She begins to speak, her voice soft and ethereal, yet filled with an undeniable authority. For centuries, this was the image we've held of the oracle, a mystical conduit between the mortal realm and the gods. Kings and emperors would travel great distances to seek her counsel, believing that her words could shape the fate of their kingdoms, their battles, and their destinies. Her words were sacred, often cryptic, but always believed to carry the weight of divine authority. Yet, what if there was more to this than met the eye? What if these ancient rituals were not just divine messages from the heavens, but carefully constructed performances designed to create a sense of awe, wonder, and most importantly, control? Take, for example, the Oracle of Delphi, perhaps the most famous of all ancient oracles. The Pythia, as she was known, would sit on a tripod above a fissure in the earth, inhaling the vapors that emanated from deep within the ground. It was believed that these vapors induced a trance-like state, allowing the oracle to communicate with the gods. But what if these vapors were not divine at all? What if they were, in fact, hallucinogenic gases, natural compounds that altered the mind, making the oracle vulnerable to suggestion, to the manipulation of those who sought to control her? There is evidence to suggest that the fumes at Delphi may have contained ethylene, a gas that can cause feelings of euphoria, altered perception, and hallucinations. Was this truly the work of the gods? Or was it a clever use of natural substances to create the illusion of divine communication? The concept of oracles as instruments of mind control isn't limited to Delphi. Across the ancient world, we find similar practices, rituals that blurred the lines between spiritual communication and psychological manipulation. In ancient Egypt, the priests of the temples would use incense and chants to induce trance states in their initiates, allowing them to speak with the gods. In Rome, emperors relied on soothsayers and augurs to interpret the will of the gods, often using these prophecies to justify their actions, from military campaigns to political decisions. But in many cases, these soothsayers weren't just relaying divine messages. They were creating an environment in which their own interpretations of events were seen as the will of the gods. Prophecies could be manipulated, twisted, or fabricated entirely to serve the agendas of those in power. So, What does this mean for our understanding of these ancient rituals? If oracles were not truly speaking to gods, but rather engaging in complex psychological tactics designed to elicit a certain response from those who sought their counsel, what does that say about the role of the oracle in ancient society? Could it be that oracles were not mere passive conduits of divine wisdom, but active participants in a much larger game of power and control? Consider the case of the famous Oracle of Delphi once more. There are accounts that suggest the priests who attended to the Pythia were heavily involved in the process of interpreting the oracles. While the Pythia herself may have been in a trance, the priests were often the ones who would interpret her words, shaping them in ways that would align with the political and military agendas of the day. Was the oracle truly a voice of the gods, or was it a tool carefully wielded by those who understood how to manipulate the psychological and social dynamics of the time? This idea of the oracle as a manipulative force is not a new one. Throughout history, leaders have sought to control public perception, to shape the beliefs and behaviors of the masses through the use of religious or mystical symbols. In the ancient world, the oracle served as a perfect instrument for this. Her words, believed to be divine, carried an immense amount of weight. But the power of the oracle didn't lie solely in the belief that she could predict the future. It lay in the way her words could influence actions, drive wars, and justify the decisions of the powerful. Let's take a step back and consider the broader picture. Oracles were not just voices of the divine. They were cultural institutions, embedded deeply within the political, social, and religious fabric of their societies. To understand the full impact of oracles, we need to examine how they were used not just as spiritual guides, but as tools of power. After all, in ancient Greece, Rome, and Egypt, religion and politics were often indistinguishable. The gods and goddesses weren't just figures of worship. They were political forces, wielded by those in power to justify their rule, to rally armies, and to shape the direction of entire civilizations. The idea that oracles were controlled or manipulated by those in power becomes even more intriguing when you consider the role of secrecy in their practices. In many cases, the words of the oracle were shrouded in mystery, veiled in symbolism that could be interpreted in numerous ways. This ambiguity allowed for a great deal of flexibility in how the oracle's words were applied. A prophecy that seemed to foretell one outcome could be twisted to justify an entirely different course of action. The ambiguity of the oracle's pronouncements gave those who interpreted them considerable power, allowing them to shape the outcome of events based on their own agendas. But this wasn't just about political manipulation, it was also about control over the psyche. The power of belief, the idea that a prophecy or divine message could shape the actions of individuals and nations, is one of the most potent forms of control. The oracle, with her enigmatic words and trance-induced visions, tapped directly into this power. People were willing to place their faith in these figures, to believe that the future could be foretold by someone who communed with the gods. And in doing so, they relinquished control over their own destiny, surrendering their agency to the divine will as interpreted by the oracle. So, what can we learn from this? Perhaps the most unsettling truth is that the oracles were not so much instruments of divine insight as they were tools of psychological manipulation. Whether through hallucinatory vapors, cryptic symbolism, or carefully orchestrated performances, the oracles of the ancient world were shaped by human hands, designed to manipulate belief and steer the course of history. And while the gods may have never directly whispered into the ears of kings and generals, the voices of the oracles were powerful enough to change the world. As we delve deeper into the history of oracles and divination, we begin to see that the true source of their power was not in divine prophecy, but in their ability to manipulate the minds of those who sought their counsel. The mystery of the oracle, it turns out, is not just about the unknown future, it's about the unknown forces that have always shaped the present. What if the true source of the oracle's power was not divine intervention, but something far more human, far more dangerous? What if the voice of the gods was not a voice at all, but a carefully constructed illusion? The answer, perhaps, lies in the shadows of history, waiting to be uncovered. And as we peel back the layers of myth and mystery, we may just find that the truth is more unsettling than we ever could have imagined. The true source of oracles may not be the gods, but the masters of manipulation, those who learned to control not just the future, but the minds of those who sought to understand it. The ancient world was a place of mystery, a time when the line between the divine and the human was often blurred. It was a world where the supernatural held sway over everyday life, and the heavens seemed just a prayer away. In this world, divination, seeking knowledge of the future through supernatural means, was a widespread practice, one that was believed to offer a glimpse into the cosmic order of things. It was also a world that gave birth to some of the most famous oracles in history, figures whose influence and power transcended borders and dynasties, whose words could shape the fate of empires. But how did this practice begin? How did divination, this search for hidden knowledge, emerge in the first place? And what role did oracles play in the shaping of civilizations? To understand the origins of divination, we must first look at the birth of the ancient civilizations that would give rise to these sacred practices. The earliest known examples of divination can be traced back to the Sumerians, who lived in what is now modern-day Iraq. Around 3000 BCE, Sumer was one of the first places where writing systems and complex religious practices were developed. In this early society, the Sumerians believed that the gods played an active role in shaping the events of the world. They believed that the future was not a series of random events, but rather a pattern determined by divine forces, and it was their duty to uncover these divine intentions. The Sumerians used various forms of divination to interpret the will of the gods. One of the earliest methods involved interpreting the patterns of animal entrails, particularly the liver. The practice, known as hepatoscopy, was believed to reveal divine messages when the liver of a sacrificial animal was examined for irregularities. This form of divination wasn't limited to Sumer. It spread to other ancient cultures, including the Babylonians and the Assyrians, and would later be adopted by the Greeks and Romans. But the Sumerians were not alone in their quest to read the signs of the divine. They were merely the first to formalize it, and their methods would lay the foundation for countless others who sought to understand the will of the gods. In Egypt, divination took on a slightly different form. The Egyptians were deeply concerned with maintaining order, which they referred to as Ma'at, a cosmic balance that governed both the physical and spiritual worlds. The Egyptians saw the world as an interconnected system where the actions of individuals, the movements of the stars, and the flow of the Nile River were all intricately linked. In order to maintain Ma'at, the Egyptians believed that they needed to interpret the signs of the gods in their environment. Priests would often use astrology to discern the will of the gods, calculating the positions of the stars and planets in relation to earthly events. But divination wasn't limited to the stars. The Egyptians also used dreams as a means of receiving divine guidance, interpreting them as messages from the gods or from deceased ancestors. In fact, many temples had designated dream interpreters whose sole job was to decode the visions of those who sought divine insight. While the Sumerians and Egyptians were focusing on the movements of animals and the stars, the Greeks, centuries later, would introduce a more structured and ritualistic form of divination. It was in ancient Greece that the concept of the oracle truly came into its own. The oracle was more than just a tool for personal insight. It became a central figure in the religious and political life of the Greeks. Oracles were seen as intermediaries between the gods and humanity. Their words were considered sacred, and their predictions were taken as divine truth. But the most famous of all Greek oracles was the Oracle of Delphi, which became synonymous with prophecy and divine wisdom. The Oracle of Delphi was situated on the slopes of Mount Parnassus, in a temple dedicated to the god Apollo. The Pythia, the priestess who served as the oracle, was believed to possess the ability to communicate directly with Apollo. It was said that she would enter a trance-like state, induced by vapors rising from a chasm beneath the temple, and in this state, she would utter cryptic messages that were interpreted by the priests. The Oracle of Delphi became the most revered in the ancient Greek world, and its influence spread far beyond Greece. Kings, generals, and citizens alike would travel to Delphi from across the Mediterranean, seeking guidance on everything from personal matters to matters of state. The Pythia's prophecies were often vague, leaving room for multiple interpretations. This ambiguity allowed the priests at Delphi to manipulate the messages in ways that suited the political climate of the time. A prophecy that seemed to predict one outcome could be twisted to justify entirely different actions, which only added to the oracle's mystique. The oracle didn't just predict the future, it shaped it. By offering advice that could be interpreted in various ways, the oracle allowed the powerful to mold the world according to their will, all while maintaining the illusion of divine sanction. The Oracle of Delphi became a tool of both personal and political control, and it was this combination of religion, ritual, and psychology that made oracles such powerful figures in ancient civilizations. But the rise of Greek oracles was not without its challenges. While Delphi was the most famous, other oracles also began to emerge across the Greek world. Each had its own methods, from the Oracle of Dodona, which relied on the rustling of leaves in sacred oak trees to communicate the will of Zeus, to the Oracle of Olympia, where sacrifices and omens were used to divine the future. The proliferation of these oracles reflected the growing importance of divination in the Greek world, and it was in this environment that the practice would evolve, spreading from Greece to other ancient civilizations. One of the most fascinating aspects of Greek oracles is the way they were integrated into society. Divination was not just the domain of kings and generals. It was a practice that permeated every level of society. Citizens would consult oracles to guide decisions on personal matters, such as marriage or business, and soldiers would seek the oracle's favor before going into battle. The influence of oracles was so great that it became an integral part of Greek life. But this influence was not limited to Greece. As the Greek Empire expanded, so too did the practice of consulting oracles. The Romans, for example, adopted many of the Greek methods of divination, and their emperors frequently sought guidance from oracles to justify their actions. As the Romans adopted Greek methods, they also began to develop their own forms of divination. The Romans were particularly fond of augury, the practice of interpreting the behavior of birds, and haruspicy, which involved examining the entrails of sacrificed animals. These methods were deeply ingrained in Roman society, and they played a crucial role in the decision-making processes of Roman leaders. The Roman Empire was built on a foundation of divination and the belief that the gods could influence the fate of the empire. Emperors, generals, and officials all relied on oracles and divination to guide their decisions, from military campaigns to political appointments. In fact, the relationship between the Roman emperors and the oracles was often one of mutual dependence. The emperors relied on the oracles to legitimize their rule, while the oracles depended on the emperors for protection and support. It was a symbiotic relationship, one that ensured the continued influence of oracles in Roman society. But as the empire grew, so too did the complexity of divination. New methods and new rituals were developed, each more sophisticated than the last. But at its core, divination remained the same. A way to understand the will of the gods, a way to see into the future, and a way to guide the present. The practice of divination also spread eastward, influencing cultures as far as India and China, where divination became an integral part of religious and political life. In China, the ancient practice of casting lots to interpret the will of the gods, known as casting the bones, became a common form of divination. In India, astrology and the study of the stars played a central role in determining the future, a practice that continues to this day. These Eastern practices were not so different from those of the West. They were rooted in the same belief that the future was written in the stars, that the will of the gods could be interpreted by those skilled in the art of divination. And so, the practice of divination spread across the ancient world, evolving with each civilization it touched. It began as a way to understand the divine order, but over time, it became a tool of political and social control. Oracles, once seen as sacred conduits to the divine, became instruments of manipulation, their cryptic messages wielded by the powerful to shape the fate of nations. But what made divination so powerful wasn't just the belief in the gods, it was the belief in the oracles themselves. People were willing to put their trust in these figures, believing that they could uncover the hidden truths of the world. And as long as people believed in them, the oracles would continue to hold sway over the course of history. The Oracle of Delphi holds an iconic place in the history of ancient Greece, a symbol of divine insight, prophecy, and the sacred connection between humanity and the gods. Its fame has endured for millennia, making it one of the most recognized oracles in the world. Yet, behind its mythic status lies a complex and often enigmatic reality. What was it about the Oracle of Delphi that made it the most revered of all the ancient oracles? And why did people travel from far and wide, seeking the guidance of the Pythia, the priestess who served as the medium through which Apollo supposedly spoke? The mystery of Delphi is both a reflection of ancient Greece's relationship with the divine and a testament to how religion, ritual, and power became intertwined in ways that would shape the trajectory of empires, politics, and history itself. Delphi was not just any temple, nor was it merely a place of spiritual devotion. It was located on the slopes of Mount Parnassus, in a region regarded as the center of the world by the ancient Greeks, a place they called the Omphalos, or navel of the earth. This connection to the very heart of the world lent the site an air of sacredness and mysticism. To the Greeks, Delphi was the place where heaven and earth met, where the divine descended to commune with mortals. The temple itself, dedicated to Apollo, stood as a beacon of religious and political influence. It was here that the Oracle of Delphi would reveal its prophecies, guiding kings, generals, and citizens alike on matters ranging from war and politics to personal decisions. The reverence for this site was unparalleled, and the power of its prophecy extended far beyond the borders of Greece. The Oracle of Delphi was famous not just for the reliability of its predictions, but also for the enigmatic nature of the messages that the Pythia, the oracle, would deliver. The Pythia's utterances were often cryptic, ambiguous, and open to multiple interpretations. This vagueness was a defining feature of Delphi's prophecies, which allowed for a wide array of readings, all of which could be bent to suit different political, personal, or military needs. As a result, the words of the oracle were often interpreted by priests who served as intermediaries, shaping the prophecy's message to align with the desires of the powerful individuals who sought it out. A king who might receive a prophecy foretelling the fall of an empire could choose to interpret it as a warning to prepare for conflict, or as a call to act decisively in defense of his reign. A general could receive a prophecy that foretold a glorious victory, but if the interpretation was manipulated, it could justify a costly battle that would turn the tide of an entire war. The Pythia's role as a medium for divine revelation became entangled with the political machinations of the time, where the power of prophecy was used to manipulate the course of history itself. The process by which the Pythia would enter into a trance-like state, through which she would deliver her prophecies, is one of the most fascinating and mysterious aspects of Delphi's oracle. Ancient accounts suggest that the Pythia would sit on a tripod, placed directly above a chasm in the earth that emitted gases from deep underground. The exact nature of these gases remains a subject of much debate, but it is widely believed that they were either hallucinogenic vapors or natural substances that had a profound effect on the mind and body. Some scholars believe that the Pythia would inhale ethylene, a gas known to induce euphoria, dizziness, and altered perceptions of reality. Others suggest that the vapors could have been a mixture of methane and other volatile substances, creating a powerful hallucinatory experience. The idea that the oracle's prophecies were induced by substances that affected the brain raises questions about the true nature of divine inspiration and the possibility that the oracle's visions were not purely divine, but chemically induced. In this trance-like state, the Pythia would begin to speak in an altered voice, her words often incomprehensible or jumbled. The priests of the temple, who were skilled in interpreting these utterances, would then translate her words into more coherent statements, often wrapped in riddles and allegories. These cryptic messages were then presented to the person seeking the prophecy, whether a ruler or a commoner. The words of the oracle were never straightforward. They were meant to challenge the listener to engage with the mystery of the future. The ambiguity of the oracle's responses meant that they could be interpreted in multiple ways, a feature that enhanced their power and allowed them to be used in the service of a variety of political and personal agendas. Despite the oracle's cryptic nature, its influence was undeniable. Rulers from all over the ancient world sought the guidance of the oracle before making critical decisions. It is said that Croesus, the wealthy king of Lydia, consulted the oracle before launching a campaign against Persia. The prophecy he received famously told him that if he went to war, he would destroy a great empire. Croesus, interpreting this as a sign of victory, marched into battle, only to suffer a crushing defeat, losing his kingdom in the process. The oracle's prophecy had been fulfilled in a way that Croesus had not anticipated, highlighting the potential dangers of relying too heavily on ambiguous guidance. The story of Croesus became legendary, a cautionary tale about the limitations of prophecy and the perils of misinterpreting divine messages. The story of Alexander the Great also offers a fascinating glimpse into the power and influence of the oracle. Alexander, who would go on to conquer much of the known world, visited Delphi during his military campaigns. In an intriguing turn of events, the priests at Delphi were initially reluctant to offer him a prophecy, as they feared angering the powerful general. But when Alexander insisted, the Pythia allegedly prophesied that he would be invincible in battle, but only if he refrained from desecrating the sacred site. This message, once again, was open to interpretation. Some saw it as a sign of divine favor, while others considered it a warning against overreach. Regardless, Alexander took the prophecy as confirmation of his destiny to conquer the world, and his subsequent success only reinforced the oracle's reputation as a powerful source of guidance. While the Oracle of Delphi was primarily associated with Apollo, the god to whom the temple was dedicated, its role as a center of prophecy was not confined solely to this deity. Delphi had long been seen as a sacred site, and the oracle itself was believed to be a place where the gods could communicate with humanity in various forms. As such, people from all walks of life visited the oracle, not only seeking answers to political and military questions, but also seeking advice on personal matters, from marriage to business decisions. The oracle, therefore, served as both a religious institution and a social hub, where people from across the ancient world came to seek divine intervention for the most intimate and profound aspects of their lives. Over time, however, the power of the oracle began to wane. With the rise of new religious practices, particularly the spread of Christianity, the role of traditional Greek oracles diminished. The temples of Delphi were abandoned, and the once powerful influence of the oracle faded into myth and legend. Yet, even in the modern era, the legacy of the Oracle of Delphi endures. It remains an emblem of the ancient world's deep connection to the supernatural and a reminder of the role that prophecy has played in shaping history. The story of Delphi, with its mystery and intrigue, serves as a testament to the ways in which humanity has always sought to uncover the secrets of the future, even if those secrets were nothing more than smoke and mirrors, clouded in ambiguity and uncertainty. The Oracle of Delphi, in its prime, was more than just a religious institution. It was a powerful social and political force, a tool for manipulation, and a means of shaping the destiny of nations. The words of the Pythia were not just divine revelations. They were carefully crafted prophecies that could be interpreted to serve the needs of the powerful. The oracle's messages were as much about politics and power as they were about the divine, and its influence was felt far beyond the walls of the temple. As such, the Oracle of Delphi stands as one of the most fascinating and complex institutions of the ancient world, a symbol of the intricate interplay between religion, politics, and the human desire to peer into the unknown future. The role of prophecy in the ancient world was not confined to religious rituals alone. It was intricately woven into the very fabric of political life. The significance of oracles, particularly the Oracle of Delphi, extended far beyond the spiritual realm. The prophecies uttered by the Pythia, the priestess of Delphi, had a profound impact on the decisions of kings, generals, and entire empires. They were not mere predictions but tools of political influence, wielded by those in power to justify their actions, shape their policies, and even solidify their rule. The idea that divine will could be discerned through a mystical, cryptic oracle gave the powerful a seemingly unquestionable authority to guide the course of history. The Oracle of Delphi became an indispensable instrument in the hands of rulers who sought not just to understand the future, but to control it. The kings of Greece, the generals of Rome, and even leaders from distant lands would send emissaries to Delphi to consult the oracle before making critical decisions, from waging war to planning political strategies. The power of these prophecies lay not just in their content, but in the belief that they were divinely inspired. To question the will of the oracle was to question the will of the gods themselves, a taboo that no ruler could afford to risk. Thus, the oracle's authority became a cornerstone upon which many of the most significant actions in ancient history were based. Consider, for example, the story of King Croesus of Lydia, one of the wealthiest and most powerful rulers of his time. Before embarking on a military campaign against Persia, Croesus sought the guidance of the Oracle of Delphi. He received a prophecy that foretold that if he went to war, he would destroy a great empire. Confident in his own strength and the oracle's favorable response, Croesus launched his campaign, believing that victory was guaranteed. However, the prophecy was fulfilled in an unexpected way. Croesus lost the war and his kingdom was conquered. The great empire that was destroyed was not his enemies, but his own. This story has become one of the most famous examples of how oracles, while seemingly providing divine insight, could also be used to manipulate those in power and lead them to their downfall. This incident reveals an important facet of the oracle's role in ancient politics: the ambiguity of its prophecies. The Oracle of Delphi was famous for offering answers that were cryptic and open to interpretation. A prophecy that seemed to predict one outcome could easily be interpreted as foretelling something entirely different, depending on the perspective of the ruler receiving it. This ambiguity made the oracle a powerful tool for those in power, as it allowed them to frame the prophecy in a way that suited their own agendas. If a king received a prophecy that seemed ominous, he could choose to interpret it as a warning and take action to avert disaster. If the prophecy seemed favorable, it could be seen as a divine endorsement, justifying military campaigns, political decisions, or even the expansion of an empire. In ancient Greece, the relationship between oracles and political power was particularly pronounced. The city-states of Greece were often in a constant state of conflict, whether through wars, territorial disputes, or internal political struggles. In this environment, oracles were not just consulted for guidance. They were used as instruments of power, designed to sway public opinion, gain political support, and justify military action. The most famous example of this can be found in the story of the Persian Wars, when the Greek city-states faced the impending invasion of the Persian Empire. The Greeks turned to the Oracle of Delphi for counsel, seeking a prophecy that would guide them in the face of this existential threat. The response they received was as cryptic as it was powerful. "The wooden walls alone shall save you." The interpretation of this prophecy became a pivotal moment in the Greek defense against the Persians. The oracle's reference to wooden walls was initially ambiguous. Was it referring to the walls of the city, or to the wooden ships of the Greek navy? After much debate, the Greeks decided that the prophecy referred to their naval fleet, which would prove to be the decisive factor in their victory at the Battle of Salamis. The oracle's cryptic message thus became a rallying cry, a divine endorsement of the strategy that would lead to the defeat of the Persian Empire. The use of the oracle in this context is a powerful illustration of how prophecy could be manipulated to serve political ends. The oracle's words, though vague, were ultimately molded into a powerful justification for the Greek military response, transforming a simple prediction into a self-fulfilling prophecy that changed the course of history. But the influence of oracles was not confined to Greece alone. As the Roman Empire expanded, the practice of consulting oracles spread across the Mediterranean world. The Romans, too, recognized the political utility of divination and sought the guidance of the gods to justify their military conquests and political decisions. The Roman emperors, in particular, relied heavily on the guidance of soothsayers and augurs, individuals who specialized in interpreting omens and signs. These augurs were often consulted before key decisions were made, especially in matters of war. A Roman general would seek the approval of the gods through augury before launching a military campaign, believing that the divine will would either support or oppose his actions. In this way, the Roman Empire was built not only on military might but on the belief that the gods were directly involved in shaping the empire's destiny. One of the most famous examples of prophecy's political power in Rome comes from the story of Julius Caesar. As the leader of Rome's transformation from a republic to an empire, Caesar was acutely aware of the importance of maintaining his authority and legitimacy. To reinforce his rule, he often sought the counsel of oracles, believing that divine support was essential for his political survival. One of the most significant moments in his career came shortly before his assassination in 44 BCE. A soothsayer famously warned Caesar to beware the Ides of March, a prophecy that would become one of the most iconic in history. Despite the warning, Caesar proceeded to the Senate on the fateful day, where he was assassinated by a group of conspirators. The prophecy of the soothsayer, though seemingly ignored, became a symbol of Caesar's tragic downfall and the fragility of power, even in the face of divine foresight. What is particularly fascinating about the story of Julius Caesar is the way in which prophecy and political power became entangled in Roman society. Prophecies were not just seen as divine revelations. They were tools used by rulers to solidify their authority and influence. Caesar, like many before him, used prophecy to enhance his own image and to maintain the perception that he was chosen by the gods to lead Rome. His belief in the prophetic messages, even when they seemed to forewarn his death, highlights the paradoxical nature of prophecy in the ancient world. It was both a source of power and a reminder of the inherent uncertainty of fate. The relationship between prophecy and power also played a central role in the rise and fall of many other ancient rulers. The history of the ancient world is replete with examples of leaders who consulted oracles to justify their decisions, whether it was the launching of wars, the expansion of empires, or the consolidation of power. Prophecy, when used effectively, could transform a political decision into a divine mandate, elevating the ruler's actions to the level of cosmic significance. By framing their decisions in the language of divine will, rulers could not only legitimize their actions but also unite their people under the belief that they were fulfilling a greater, divine purpose. In many ways, the political use of oracles and prophecy reflects a broader human desire to control the future, to take the unpredictable forces of fate and shape them into something tangible, something that could be understood and manipulated. The ancient world was full of uncertainties. Wars, famines, political instability, and shifting alliances. In this context, oracles provided a semblance of order, offering a glimpse into the future, however uncertain, and offering those in power a tool by which they could steer their course through the tumult of the unknown. Yet, as much as oracles were used for political gain, they also served as a reminder of the limits of human control. The ambiguity of the prophecies, the sometimes disastrous results of relying too heavily on divine guidance, revealed a deeper truth, that even in the most structured and powerful societies, the future remained an enigma. The role of the oracle, then, was not simply to predict or guide, but to remind the powerful that their control was, at best, an illusion. In the end, the ancient use of oracles shows us that power, no matter how divinely sanctioned, is always precarious, and that the future, though shaped by human action, remains shrouded in mystery. The ancient world was a place where the boundaries between the sacred and the mundane were often indistinguishable. Prophecies, divinations, and visions were not only accepted as part of everyday life, but were actively sought to guide everything from personal choices to the most monumental decisions of rulers. Among the most iconic symbols of this deeply spiritual world was the oracle. The oracle wasn't merely a figure that foretold the future, it was an institution, a gateway through which the divine and the human interacted. However, it would be naive to believe that the oracles were entirely detached from the human world. The divine words that were delivered were not always pure revelations from gods, but rather messages deeply intertwined with human intentions, shaped by the pressures of politics, power, and control. The idea that prophecy could be manipulated for political and personal gain wasn't just confined to Greece or Rome. It was a theme that spread across cultures, becoming an essential feature of governance, warfare, and leadership. While the Oracle of Delphi is the most famous example, its counterparts across the ancient world played similar roles in offering guidance that was often used to solidify political authority and validate decisions of war, peace, and conquest. The idea of divine favor could be manipulated to justify everything from military campaigns to royal succession, and as a result, the very institution of prophecy became a reflection of the power structures that sought to control it. Take, for instance, the role of the oracle in the ancient Egyptian context. While the Oracle of Delphi was deeply tied to the Greek gods, Egyptian oracles were often associated with gods like Ammonius or Ra, whose favor was sought in much the same way. The priesthood of Egypt wielded considerable influence, as oracles were not only a source of spiritual guidance but also a tool of statecraft. The Egyptian pharaohs, who were considered to be divine rulers themselves, often consulted oracles in times of uncertainty, be it in matters of military conflict or dynastic succession. The oracle's word was seen as the voice of the gods, and to challenge it was to challenge the very legitimacy of the ruler. As Egypt's political and military power waned over time, the oracle's influence too began to ebb, but not without leaving its mark on the ways that rulers in subsequent centuries used prophecy as a tool of governance. Much like in Egypt, the ancient Roman Empire also recognized the inherent political power embedded within prophecy. Roman leaders, especially emperors, turned to oracles to provide divine legitimacy to their actions, whether they were waging wars or undertaking social reforms. The role of the soothsayer in Roman society was profound. Augurs were not only consulted about the weather and auspices but also about matters concerning the military, judicial, and religious domains. The words of these augurs, though rooted in nature, were often interpreted and shaped to fit the political objectives of the time. For example, when Emperor Augustus embarked on his campaign to stabilize and consolidate the Roman Empire, he frequently consulted oracles to legitimize his reign. In his case, prophecy became a tool to solidify his status as a ruler chosen by the gods to restore order to the Roman world. But the question arises, why would these so-called divine messages be so malleable? Why would those who claim to speak for the gods rely on interpretations that align so perfectly with the desires of the powerful? The truth lies in the nature of prophecy itself. Prophecies are, by their very nature, vague and open to interpretation. The more cryptic and ambiguous a prophecy, the more room there is for manipulation. This made oracles uniquely positioned in the political landscape of the ancient world. The deliberate ambiguity of prophetic statements allowed them to serve multiple purposes. A prophecy could be shaped to reflect the aspirations of those in power, providing them with the divine sanction they needed to move forward with their plans. In some cases, this meant justifying acts of violence, while in others, it helped affirm the emperor's role as the one true ruler appointed by the gods. This same strategy of manipulation can be observed in the way oracles were used during times of war. Throughout history, military commanders have been especially susceptible to the idea that divine guidance could tip the scales of fate. Ancient armies often consulted oracles to ensure success in battle. But the oracles, too, were often swayed by the political climate and the interests of those who consulted them. One of the most remarkable examples comes from the story of the Trojan War, an event that has transcended mythology to become one of the most famous examples of divine intervention in warfare. The Greeks, as they prepared for battle against Troy, turned to the oracle of Delphi for guidance. The prophecy they received was a mixed one. There were promises of victory, but also warnings of sacrifice. The Greek leaders interpreted the prophecy as a call to launch the war, even if it meant suffering great loss. This ability to interpret prophecies flexibly, in a way that suited the interests of the powerful, was an essential part of how oracles functioned in ancient societies. The ambiguity provided space for leaders to craft their narratives around divine will, shaping the outcome of wars and battles in ways that would seem almost predestined to the common people. Another interesting dimension of the oracle's role in politics can be observed in its function as a diplomatic tool. In ancient times, empires and city-states often sought oracles as intermediaries in matters of peace, alliances, and treaties. Prophecies could be used to strengthen diplomatic ties by giving the illusion of divine sanction to agreements that may have otherwise been seen as politically unwise. When one nation or ruler sought to form an alliance, for instance, they could seek the guidance of an oracle to secure divine approval, and thus present the alliance as not merely a political maneuver, but a divinely ordained act. The ambiguity inherent in the oracle's pronouncements made them a versatile tool in the diplomatic arsenal, allowing them to be molded to fit a wide variety of contexts. The oracle, therefore, was not just a source of individual guidance but a mechanism through which rulers could advance their diplomatic agendas. The use of oracles for political purposes was not just confined to the grand figures of history. Ordinary citizens, too, relied on oracles for advice and insight into their personal lives. The very idea that one's fate could be directed by a divine power was both empowering and comforting. For the common people, the Oracle of Delphi and other similar institutions were places where they could receive guidance on matters as diverse as marriage, business, or personal safety. In times of hardship or uncertainty, an oracle's words could provide clarity or hope, offering individuals the belief that there was a higher force at work guiding their lives. The idea of divine intervention was deeply embedded in the social fabric of ancient societies, and as such, oracles became an integral part of everyday life. Yet, even as oracles provided comfort and guidance, they also created a power dynamic that was rooted in fear and uncertainty. By relying on divine intervention, people could feel absolved of responsibility for their actions, knowing that their fate was ultimately determined by a higher power. This created a dangerous dependency on the oracle's pronouncements. In a sense, the oracle's authority over the future served to entrench social hierarchies and political systems, where the powerful could manipulate the divine message to maintain control, while the common people could be swayed by the idea that their lives were shaped by forces beyond their comprehension. The oracle's words carried with them an aura of inevitability that could silence dissent and quell resistance, reinforcing the belief that whatever happened was part of a greater cosmic plan. As time passed, however, the influence of oracles began to diminish, particularly with the rise of new religious ideologies and philosophies. The spread of Christianity throughout the Roman Empire marked the beginning of the end for traditional divination and the role of the oracle. With the advent of monotheism, the very idea of consulting multiple gods for guidance became anathema to the Christian worldview. The Oracle of Delphi itself, once a beacon of spiritual and political power, was abandoned, its temple eventually falling into ruins. The fall of Delphi was symbolic of the broader shift in the religious and political landscape of the ancient world, where the oracle's once dominant role was replaced by a new sense of spiritual authority. But even as the oracle's physical presence faded, its legacy lived on. The practice of seeking divine guidance, whether through religious leaders or new forms of prophecy, continued to shape the way people looked at power, fate, and the future. The stories of Delphi, of the Pythia, and the cryptic prophecies have survived to this day, influencing not only history but also modern conceptions of prophecy, mysticism, and the ways in which power can be manipulated under the guise of divine will. The relationship between rulers and oracles, between divine messages and political agendas, continues to serve as a reminder of the complex interplay between belief and power, a dynamic that has shaped the course of human history in profound and often unexpected ways. The decline of the ancient oracles and their fading influence over the course of history is a fascinating tale of cultural transformation. For centuries, oracles like Delphi stood at the heart of both spiritual and political life, offering prophecies that shaped decisions of war, peace, politics, and personal lives. Yet, the rise of new philosophies, changing political realities, and the advent of monotheism would eventually lead to the eclipse of oracles in favor of other forms of spiritual authority. The disappearance of the Oracle of Delphi, once the most revered of all oracles, serves as a symbol of the broader shift in the way the ancient world interacted with the divine and sought to understand the future. At the height of their power, oracles were not merely spiritual institutions. They were enmeshed in the very fabric of governance, providing divine validation for rulers and decisions that would otherwise be questioned. The priests and priestesses who served as the intermediaries between the divine and the mortal world were seen as conduits through which the gods directly communicated. The most famous of these oracles, the Oracle of Delphi, was believed to be the mouthpiece of Apollo, the god of prophecy, music, and healing. The Pythia, the priestess who served as the oracle, would fall into a trance-like state and utter cryptic pronouncements that were often interpreted by priests. The ambiguity of these messages allowed for multiple interpretations, which could be molded to fit the desires and needs of those who sought guidance. The Oracle of Delphi was not alone in its influence, but it was certainly the most influential, drawing kings, generals, and ordinary citizens from all corners of the Mediterranean world. Emperors such as Alexander the Great, military leaders like Croesus of Lydia, and statesmen all turned to Delphi for advice, believing that the words of the oracle carried divine sanction. The messages from Delphi, though vague, carried an aura of certainty, as they were regarded as the will of the gods, often making them the final word in political and military decisions. However, as powerful as they were, the oracles were never free from manipulation. The very nature of the prophecies, with their riddles and ambiguity, allowed those in power to shape and interpret the words of the gods to suit their own political ends. The rise of Christianity marked the beginning of the end for the traditional role of the oracle in the Roman Empire. Christianity's monotheistic worldview clashed fundamentally with the polytheistic religious system that had given rise to oracles like Delphi. The new Christian doctrine, with its singular God and rejection of other gods, directly undermined the very foundation of oracular prophecy. As the Christian faith spread across the Roman Empire, oracles began to be viewed with suspicion and disdain, as remnants of an old pagan world that was in conflict with the new religious order. The rise of Christian emperors and the eventual adoption of Christianity as the state religion in the 4th century CE accelerated the decline of pagan practices, including the use of oracles. The formal closure of the Oracle of Delphi is often attributed to the Roman Emperor Theodosius I, who ruled from 379 to 395 CE. In 391 CE, he issued an edict that prohibited pagan rituals and closed the temples of the ancient gods. This edict signaled the end of the Oracle of Delphi as a functioning religious institution, effectively silencing the voices that had once guided rulers and citizens alike. Delphi's temple was abandoned, its oracle rendered obsolete in the new Christian world. The grand temple that had once housed the Pythia, where the cryptic prophecies were uttered, fell into ruin. Delphi's influence was reduced to myth and legend, relegated to the past as Christianity's influence spread throughout the empire. However, the closure of Delphi was not the end of the fascination with oracles. Even as the oracles were silenced, their legacy persisted in the collective memory of the ancient world. The idea that the gods could speak through humans, guiding them toward the future, continued to resonate in later religious and mystical traditions. Throughout the Middle Ages and even into the Renaissance, the practice of divination would reemerge, albeit in different forms. The use of astrology, reading tarot cards, and other forms of seeking divine guidance became popular during these periods, though they never quite regained the same prominence as the ancient oracles. The decline of the oracles also represents a larger cultural and intellectual shift in the way the ancient world viewed the divine and the future. In earlier times, the gods were thought to have an active, direct role in shaping human destiny. The oracles were seen as intermediaries, helping mortals understand the will of the gods and guiding them toward the best possible future. The ambiguity of the prophecies, their open-ended nature, was part of the divine mystery that made the gods both awe-inspiring and terrifying. In many ways, the oracles served as a reflection of a world that saw the divine as an active participant in the everyday life of human beings, a world where fate could be altered, but only with the right guidance. With the rise of Christianity and other monotheistic religions, however, the role of divine intervention began to take on a different shape. Christianity, in particular, emphasized personal salvation and the relationship between the individual and a single, omnipotent God. There was no longer a need for intermediary figures like the Pythia, who spoke on behalf of the gods. The focus shifted from seeking divine knowledge through cryptic prophecies to developing a personal relationship with a God who was believed to be present and active in the lives of believers. The concept of divine favor became less about consulting oracles and more about faith, prayer, and the understanding of Scripture. The end of the oracles also marked the decline of the belief that the future was an enigma to be uncovered through rituals and spiritual guidance. Instead, a more rational, structured understanding of the world began to take hold. The rise of philosophy, particularly the works of thinkers like Plato and Aristotle, began to offer alternative ways of understanding the nature of existence and the future. The philosophical tradition placed more emphasis on reason and logic, rather than divine intervention and mystical prophecy. This shift in thinking laid the foundation for the intellectual movements of the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, which sought to move away from the mystical and toward the empirical and rational. Despite the fall of the ancient oracles, the idea that the future could be predicted or understood in mystical terms never completely disappeared. In fact, the idea of prophecy persisted through various forms of mysticism, both in the West and in the East. In the Christian tradition, mystics and saints were often believed to have the ability to see into the future or receive divine visions. These visions, though not always presented in the same way as the ancient prophecies, carried the same aura of divine authority. The idea of divination, of seeking hidden knowledge from the divine, found new expressions in other forms of mysticism, such as the mystical traditions in Islam, Judaism, such as Kabbalah, and later in various occult traditions. In modern times, the fascination with prophecy and the idea of divine guidance continues to persist, albeit in a different form. The rise of psychology, the focus on individual agency, and the scientific worldview have shifted the way that humans seek answers to the questions of life. Yet, despite our modern rationality, there is still something deeply alluring about the notion of receiving a glimpse into the future, of being able to know what lies ahead. Whether through astrology, tarot cards, or fortune-telling, humans continue to seek ways to peer beyond the veil of time and understand the path that lies ahead. The decline of the oracles, then, marks a moment of profound cultural change, one that echoes through history to the present day. While the ancient oracles have long since faded from the stage of history, their legacy continues to shape the ways in which we view fate, the divine, and our ability to influence the future. The world may have moved away from cryptic prophecies and divine voices from the heavens, but the longing for connection with the unknown and the desire to understand our place in the world remains as strong as ever. Whether through ancient rites or modern divination, the human quest for meaning, direction, and understanding of the future continues to endure. And in this way, the ancient oracles, though silent, continue to speak to us across the millennia. The fading of the ancient oracles, particularly the decline of the Oracle of Delphi, marks a pivotal point in the transition from the ancient world to the early stages of modernity. While the rise of Christianity and the demise of the polytheistic world led to the closing of temples and the end of prophetic practices in the Roman Empire, the influence of these ancient institutions is still keenly felt today. The allure of prophecy, of peering into the mysteries of the future, has endured through centuries of cultural and religious change. The idea that the divine can intervene in human affairs, providing guidance, answers, and visions of what is to come, continues to captivate the human imagination, even in the face of rationalism, scientific progress, and modern skepticism. In many ways, the end of the oracles represents not just the closure of a chapter in religious history, but the beginning of a deeper, more enduring human quest. The search for meaning and understanding in an unpredictable world. Despite the end of the ancient oracles, the practice of seeking divine guidance did not simply vanish. The desire for oracular insight remained alive, albeit in new forms. Christianity, though it replaced the old polytheistic pantheon, did not immediately erase the human need for divine revelation. Early Christian mystics and saints were believed to possess the ability to receive divine visions, and in many ways, their experiences mirrored those of the ancient oracles. These visions, however, were more personal in nature and often tied to a specific religious framework. Christianity, in particular, emphasized the relationship between the individual and God, with the focus on personal salvation rather than state-sanctioned divination. Even so, the basic human longing to connect with the divine and seek insight into the future remained as powerful as ever. As the medieval period unfolded, the rise of scholasticism, mysticism, and later the Renaissance brought about a resurgence of interest in the mystical and the prophetic. The influence of ancient oracles, though no longer central to religious practice, lived on in the mystical traditions that began to take root in the Christian world. These new forms of mystical experience often involved a deep, personal connection with God, but they shared many features with the ancient prophetic practices. Mystics like St. Teresa of Avila and St. John of the Cross received visions that they believed were divinely inspired, and these experiences were seen as a form of spiritual enlightenment, not unlike the prophecies delivered by the Pythia of Delphi. The language of visions, dreams, and divine guidance found a place in Christianity's mystical traditions, and although the institutional oracles were gone, the search for spiritual insight remained a key feature of the religious experience. The Renaissance, a period characterized by a resurgence of interest in classical knowledge and humanism, saw a revival of interest in the occult and the mystical traditions of antiquity. With the rediscovery of ancient texts and ideas, scholars began to explore the magical, divinatory, and prophetic practices that had flourished in Greece and Rome. The ancient oracles were seen as part of this intellectual inheritance, and many Renaissance thinkers sought to recover the hidden knowledge that had been lost with the rise of Christianity. This period gave birth to a new wave of interest in astrology, alchemy, and other forms of esoteric knowledge. Scholars such as Marsilio Ficino and Giovanni Pico della Mirandola were deeply influenced by the mystical traditions of the ancients and sought to reconcile these ideas with Christian theology. Astrology, which had once been integral to the practice of divination, experienced a resurgence in Renaissance Europe, with many people consulting astrologers to determine the best times for important events or to gain insight into their personal futures. One of the most fascinating aspects of this revival was the reemergence of the idea that the future could be predicted through hidden, cosmic forces. Just as the ancient Greeks had turned to the Oracle of Delphi for insight into the future, so too did Renaissance scholars, monarchs, and commoners turn to astrology, divination, and prophecy to understand what lay ahead. The power of the stars and planets, as well as the belief in divine signs, became central to the intellectual and spiritual life of the period. While the oracles of Delphi and other ancient temples were no longer in operation, the belief in a hidden, divinely orchestrated order to the universe remained alive in these new forms of knowledge. The idea that prophecy could reveal hidden truths about the future, whether through the stars, the lines of the palm, or the pages of sacred texts, continued to resonate deeply in European society. The Enlightenment, however, marked a dramatic shift in the way that people viewed the world. With the rise of reason, scientific inquiry, and rationalism, the belief in oracles, divination, and the supernatural began to wane. The Enlightenment thinkers championed the power of human reason over mystical or divine intervention. Figures such as René Descartes, Voltaire, and Immanuel Kant promoted the idea that knowledge should be based on empirical evidence and logical reasoning, rather than divine revelations or prophetic visions. This shift in intellectual thought effectively marginalized practices like astrology, fortune-telling, and other forms of divination that had once played a central role in human culture. Yet, the decline of the oracles and the rise of rationalism did not entirely erase humanity's fascination with the supernatural. Instead, this fascination was transformed and redefined. The search for meaning in a rapidly changing world, coupled with the increasing uncertainty brought on by the Industrial Revolution, continued to fuel interest in the unknown. Spiritualism, a movement that emerged in the 19th century, revived the belief in communication with the dead, and mediums became the new oracles of the modern age. People flocked to seances in search of answers from beyond the grave, believing that they could communicate with spirits and receive guidance about the future. Although these practices were often viewed with skepticism by the scientific community, they demonstrated that the desire for divine or supernatural knowledge had not disappeared. Rather, it had evolved into new forms that mirrored the ancient quest for oracular insight. At the same time, the psychological and philosophical exploration of the mind began to intersect with these mystical traditions. In the early 20th century, the rise of psychoanalysis, led by Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung, introduced new ways of understanding the human psyche and its connection to the unconscious. Jung, in particular, was interested in the archetypes and symbols that appear in dreams and visions, seeing them as manifestations of a deeper, collective unconscious that connects all humans. Jung's work explored the idea that humans are drawn to mystical and prophetic symbols because they represent a deeper truth about our shared existence. This idea, while not directly related to the oracles of antiquity, echoed the belief that there is a hidden, universal order beneath the surface of our everyday lives. In this sense, the oracles of the past were not simply divining the future. They were tapping into the universal truths that transcended individual time and space. In the 21st century, the search for prophetic knowledge continues in various forms. The widespread popularity of astrology, tarot card readings, and other forms of divination is a testament to the enduring human desire to understand the future and gain insight into the unknown. The internet has made these practices more accessible than ever, with millions of people turning to online astrology charts, psychic readings, and horoscopes in an attempt to navigate the uncertainties of their lives. While modern-day prophecies are no longer based on the elaborate rituals of the ancient oracles, they retain many of the same elements: mysticism, symbolism, and the belief that the future can be divined. In a world that is increasingly dominated by technology, uncertainty, and rapid change, the desire to connect with something greater than oneself, to seek guidance from forces beyond human understanding, remains as powerful as ever. The ancient oracles, then, did not simply disappear. They transformed. Their legacy endures in the ways that people continue to seek insight into the mysteries of life and the future. Whether through the mystical practices of the Renaissance, the psychological theories of the early 20th century, or the spiritual practices of today, the quest for divine guidance, for glimpses into the unknown, remains a deeply ingrained part of the human experience. The Oracle of Delphi may no longer speak, but its influence continues to echo through the ages. As people continue to turn to symbols, visions, and dreams in their search for meaning in a world that often feels uncertain and unknowable. The ancient desire to reach beyond the veil of time and understand the forces that shape the future remains a powerful and enduring part of the human spirit. The enduring power of oracles, even in the modern era, speaks to a deeply ingrained human need to connect with forces greater than ourselves. Throughout history, oracles served not only as spiritual guides but as tools of power and influence. They offered a divine lens through which individuals and nations sought to understand the future, making decisions that could shape empires and alter the course of history. The decline of the ancient oracles, particularly the Oracle of Delphi, marked the end of an era, but it did not signal the complete disappearance of the human quest for divine insight. Instead, it led to a transformation of the way prophecy, divination, and mystical practices were perceived and utilized in later periods. Even as the oracles fell into disuse, the belief in their powers persisted in various forms, evolving to suit the changing cultural and intellectual landscapes. The Christianization of the Roman Empire, which effectively shut down the ancient temples and their prophetic services, did not eliminate humanity's desire to know the future. Instead, it prompted the emergence of new forms of mysticism, divination, and spiritual insight. The once revered oracles were replaced by new avenues of spiritual guidance, but the core human desire to seek answers from beyond the visible world remained unchanged. One of the most fascinating transformations in the legacy of the oracles came with the rise of Christian mysticism. As the new faith spread, the idea of prophecy shifted from being a public and state-sanctioned practice to something more personal and intimate. The early Christian saints, particularly those who were regarded as holy and divinely inspired, became the new conduits for prophecy. These individuals were believed to receive visions, dreams, and messages directly from God, which often provided guidance for individuals and communities. These mystical experiences were not entirely unlike the prophecies of the ancient oracles, but they were often more focused on the personal salvation of individuals rather than political or military decision-making. The Christian mystics, such as Saint Teresa of Avila and Saint John of the Cross, were revered not for their ability to predict the future in the same way that the Pythia did, but for their ability to connect with the divine and offer spiritual insights. The language of visions, divine revelations, and prophetic dreams became central to Christian mysticism, linking it in some ways to the ancient traditions of oracular prophecy. The idea that a human could receive direct messages from God and then interpret them for the benefit of others took root in Christian theology and became an important part of the religious experience. But while Christianity offered new channels for spiritual insight, the human need for prophecy did not fade with the rise of monotheism. Instead, the pursuit of hidden knowledge and the desire to understand the future continued to be expressed in different ways. The Renaissance, a period of renewed interest in classical texts and humanism, saw a revival of interest in ancient forms of divination. The rediscovery of ancient Greek and Roman philosophies, along with the exploration of mystical traditions, led to a resurgence of interest in astrology, alchemy, and other forms of esoteric knowledge. Astrology, which had once been deeply intertwined with the oracles of Delphi, found a new place in the intellectual landscape of the Renaissance. It was during this time that astrology began to be seen not just as a tool for predicting personal fate, but as a cosmic science that could provide insights into the divine order of the universe. Scholars and thinkers of the Renaissance, including figures like Marsilio Ficino and Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, sought to bridge the gap between ancient wisdom and Christian theology, blending astrology with mystical Christianity in an attempt to uncover the hidden truths of the cosmos. In this way, the Renaissance became a period where the ancient oracles and their mysterious guidance were reborn in new forms. Alongside astrology, alchemy also experienced a resurgence during the Renaissance. Alchemists believed that they could unlock the secrets of the universe by transforming base metals into gold, as well as by discovering the elixir of life. The pursuit of this hidden knowledge was often seen as a form of divine revelation, with alchemists acting as modern-day prophets, attempting to unlock the mysteries of creation. Although alchemy was often dismissed as pseudoscience, it shared many of the same symbolic and mystical elements that had been present in ancient prophetic practices. Like the oracles of Delphi, alchemists believed that the cosmos was full of hidden forces and that understanding these forces required a connection to the divine. This resurgence of interest in mystical and esoteric knowledge did not go unnoticed by those in power. Monarchs, rulers, and even popes turned to astrology and other forms of divination to guide their decisions. The court of the Medicis, one of the most powerful families of Renaissance Italy, was home to some of the most famous astrologers of the time. Lorenzo de' Medici, known as Lorenzo the Magnificent, was particularly interested in astrology and frequently consulted with astrologers and scholars in an attempt to uncover divine guidance for his political actions. In this way, the belief in prophecy and divination became a tool of political power, much as it had been in the ancient world. The Renaissance, then, marked a period where the influence of the ancient oracles was revived in the form of astrology, alchemy, and other mystical practices that continued to shape political and personal decisions. The Enlightenment, with its emphasis on reason, science, and rationality, marked another turning point in the history of prophecy and divination. The rise of scientific thinking challenged many of the old beliefs in divine intervention and mystical knowledge. Thinkers like Voltaire, John Locke, and Immanuel Kant advocated for a worldview based on reason and empirical evidence, which sought to replace the superstitions and uncertainties of the past with a more structured and predictable understanding of the world. The Enlightenment view of the world was one in which humans could shape their own futures through knowledge and reason, without the need for divine guidance or oracular insight. However, the Enlightenment's challenge to mystical traditions did not lead to their complete disappearance. Instead, it forced prophecy and divination to adapt and evolve. While the belief in divine oracles and mysticism was marginalized during the Enlightenment, the desire for deeper knowledge of the future and the unknown did not disappear. The 19th and 20th centuries saw the rise of spiritualism, a movement that revived interest in the supernatural and the ability to communicate with spirits. Spiritualists believed that individuals could communicate with the dead through mediums, who were thought to be able to channel messages from the other side. Seances and mediumship became popular during this time, and the idea of receiving guidance from beyond the grave became a new form of divination, echoing the ancient practices of oracles who were believed to channel messages from the divine. At the same time, the early 20th century also saw the rise of psychology and the exploration of the unconscious mind. Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung were among the key figures in this intellectual revolution, exploring how the unconscious mind influenced behavior, emotions, and even decision-making. Jung, in particular, was interested in the role of symbols, archetypes, and dreams, which he believed could serve as a form of personal prophecy. For Jung, the symbols that appeared in dreams were not just random or meaningless, but represented deeper truths about the psyche and the collective unconscious. In this way, the search for prophecy and hidden knowledge took on a new, psychological dimension, as individuals sought to understand their own minds and the hidden forces that shaped their behavior. The continued fascination with prophecy in the modern era is not simply a matter of nostalgia for the ancient oracles. It reflects a deep, ongoing human need to understand the future and our place in the grand scheme of things. In a world that is increasingly complex and unpredictable, the desire to find meaning and guidance from beyond the visible world remains as powerful as ever. Whether through astrology, tarot readings, or even modern psychological practices like dream interpretation, the human search for oracular insight continues to resonate across cultures and generations. Today, prophecy is no longer viewed solely as a tool for political power or military decisions. Instead, it has become a personal pursuit, with individuals seeking answers to questions about love, career, and personal destiny. The rise of the internet has made prophecy and divination more accessible than ever before, with countless websites offering horoscopes, psychic readings, and tarot card interpretations. While the traditional oracles of the ancient world are no longer present, the underlying human need to seek guidance and understanding from a higher power persists. The modern-day oracle may not speak with the same authority as the Pythia of Delphi, but the allure of prophecy remains a powerful force that continues to shape the ways in which we understand our lives and our futures. In this way, the ancient oracles have never truly disappeared. They have transformed, evolving in response to the changing needs of humanity, but their legacy endures. Whether through astrology, spiritualism, or psychology, the quest for divine insight into the future remains an enduring part of the human experience. Just as the oracles of the ancient world were seen as a bridge between the mortal and the divine, so too do modern-day practices of divination continue to serve as a means of connecting the individual with something greater than themselves. The search for meaning, for insight, and for answers to life's great questions is an ongoing journey that transcends time, culture, and belief. The ancient oracles may no longer stand as temples on the hillsides of Greece, but their influence continues to echo throughout history and into the present day. The exploration of oracles and their influence on ancient and modern societies reveals a complex web of belief systems, power dynamics, and human desires that have shaped the course of history. These mystical figures, whose utterances were once believed to be divinely inspired, did not merely predict the future. They helped create the future. The ancient oracles, particularly the Oracle of Delphi, held immense sway over rulers and commoners alike, offering a pathway to divine guidance and decision-making that could alter the fate of empires. Their influence transcended mere prophecy, as they provided a system for governance, validation of power, and direction in moments of uncertainty. But as we move from the time of these powerful figures, we begin to see how this desire for divine insight and the connection to forces beyond human comprehension never truly disappeared, but rather evolved with time. The decline of the ancient oracles, particularly after the rise of Christianity and the closing of temples in the Roman Empire, did not signal the end of humanity's fascination with prophecy and divine guidance. It merely marked a shift in how people sought these answers. Early Christians believed in the ability of saints and mystics to receive divine revelations, a form of prophecy that was personal and tied to the Christian faith. These mystical experiences, though different in nature from the ancient oracles, were rooted in a similar desire to connect with the divine and seek answers to the mysteries of life. The mysticism that flourished in Christianity during the Middle Ages, particularly in monastic traditions, was a direct continuation of the oracular legacy. The holy men and women who were revered for their visions, dreams, and divine messages were, in a way, the spiritual successors of the ancient oracles. But unlike the oracle priestesses of Delphi, these mystics did not serve the state or political rulers in the same way. Their prophecies were more personal, focusing on the spiritual guidance of individuals and communities, helping believers navigate their lives through prayer, faith, and divine intervention. Despite this shift, the fundamental role of oracles as intermediaries between the divine and the mortal world continued to resonate within the Christian tradition. Their mystical experiences, though more rooted in religious devotion, still carried the same weight as the utterances of ancient oracles, as they too were seen as messages from a higher power. The Renaissance, which revived interest in classical knowledge and humanism, marked a dramatic resurgence of the idea that hidden knowledge, mystical, divine, or esoteric, could be uncovered. The rediscovery of ancient Greek and Roman texts, combined with the renewed focus on individualism and the human pursuit of knowledge, created a fertile ground for the resurgence of astrology, alchemy, and other forms of mysticism. In the intellectual climate of the Renaissance, thinkers such as Marsilio Ficino and Giovanni Pico della Mirandola sought to reconcile ancient pagan knowledge with Christian theology. They believed that by studying the cosmos, the stars, and the hidden forces of the universe, they could gain a deeper understanding of God's divine plan for creation. Astrology, which had been closely tied to the ancient oracles, was revived in this period as a powerful tool for understanding the universe's divine order. Astrologers were consulted not only for personal guidance but also for political advice, much like the oracles of old. But as the Renaissance progressed, the pursuit of prophecy and mystical knowledge began to take on a new, more intellectual form. The rise of scientific thought and the decline of the mystical worldview led to a new era of reason and rationality. During the Enlightenment, thinkers such as Voltaire, John Locke, and Immanuel Kant championed reason and empirical evidence, advocating for a worldview that rejected superstition and divine revelation. The belief in the power of oracles, astrology, and other forms of divination was increasingly marginalized as science and reason gained prominence. The Enlightenment's emphasis on human progress, logic, and the scientific method sought to replace the mystical and the unknown with verifiable facts and observable phenomena. Yet, even as the Enlightenment sought to rationalize the world, the desire for divine insight and the search for meaning beyond the material world did not completely fade. Instead, these longings found new outlets in spiritualism and the growing interest in the subconscious mind. In the 19th century, the spiritualist movement emerged, offering a new form of communication with the divine and the unseen. Spiritualists believed that through mediums, they could communicate with the spirits of the dead, receiving guidance and messages from beyond the grave. This was seen as a continuation of the prophetic traditions, with mediums acting as the modern-day oracles. While these practices were viewed with skepticism by the scientific community, they became a significant cultural phenomenon, providing people with the same sense of connection to a higher, unseen world that the ancient oracles had once offered. The psychological theories of Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung added another layer to this ongoing fascination with hidden knowledge. Freud's exploration of the unconscious mind and Jung's theory of the collective unconscious suggested that there were deeper, hidden forces at work within the human psyche. Jung, in particular, was interested in the archetypes and symbols that appeared in dreams and visions, seeing them as expressions of deeper universal truths. Jung's work brought a psychological dimension to the concept of prophecy, as he believed that symbols in dreams and visions could provide insights into an individual's life and the collective experience of humanity. This modern psychological approach to prophecy and mysticism helped bridge the gap between the rationalism of the Enlightenment and the human desire for connection to the mystical and the unknown. The turn of the 20th century brought with it a renewed interest in mystical traditions, with many people seeking alternative ways to understand the world beyond the confines of materialism. Occultism, astrology, and other forms of divination became increasingly popular, and the language of prophecy found a new audience in the modern world. In the 21st century, the internet has transformed the way people seek answers to life's big questions. Online astrology, tarot readings, and psychic services have become widespread, offering individuals the chance to connect with the unseen forces of the universe. These modern-day forms of divination are not too dissimilar from the ancient oracles in their symbolic use of the stars, cards, and other mystical tools. The key difference is that, rather than being reserved for kings, generals, and the powerful, prophecy has become accessible to everyone. The rise of social media and online communities has created a space where people can openly share their beliefs in the mystical and the prophetic. Websites dedicated to astrology, psychic readings, and divination attract millions of visitors, each seeking guidance and insight into their lives. The global reach of the internet has democratized prophecy, allowing individuals from all walks of life to access the kind of mystical knowledge that was once reserved for the elite. This shift reflects a broader cultural change, in which individuals are increasingly seeking personal meaning, spiritual connection, and guidance on their own terms, without relying on state-sponsored or institutionalized forms of prophecy. Yet, even as modern society has embraced new forms of mysticism and divination, there remains a tension between the rational, scientific worldview and the human desire for the mystical. The scientific revolution, with its focus on observable data and empirical evidence, has made it increasingly difficult for people to accept the validity of prophecy and divination in the traditional sense. And yet, despite the rise of rationalism and the skepticism surrounding mystical practices, the allure of the unknown continues to captivate the human imagination. The desire for connection to something beyond the material world, for guidance from the divine, or simply for answers to the mysteries of life, remains a deeply ingrained aspect of the human experience. In the end, the persistence of prophecy and divination in modern life suggests that the ancient oracles were not merely remnants of a bygone era. They were expressions of a universal human need to understand the world and our place within it. Whether through ancient rites or modern spiritual practices, the search for answers from the divine, the mysterious, and the unknown continues to shape the ways in which people seek meaning and direction in their lives. The oracles may no longer speak from the temples of ancient Greece or Rome, but the desire to hear from beyond the veil remains as strong as ever, continuing to guide and inspire those who seek answers to life's greatest questions. The intersection between oracles and the concept of mind control is a compelling and complex area of historical study. At first glance, oracles seem to belong purely to the realm of mystical or spiritual practices, offering cryptic advice or glimpses into the future that guided rulers, generals, and common people alike. But delving deeper into the role oracles played in the ancient world reveals a much darker, more manipulative side to their influence, one that touches on the psychological and political power that oracles wielded over those who sought their guidance. The Oracle of Delphi, perhaps the most famous of all oracles, offers a perfect example of how divine messages were not just perceived as spiritual truths but were also embedded within systems of control. The oracles themselves were not simply passive vessels of divine wisdom but were active participants in a broader political game. Rulers and leaders sought out the advice of oracles to legitimize their decisions, and often, these leaders would shape their actions based on the cryptic responses of the oracle, interpreting them in ways that fit their personal or political agendas. This created a form of psychological manipulation, where the very notion of fate, destiny, and divine will was used to manipulate not only the masses but the rulers themselves. It is important to note that the oracles did not speak in clear and unambiguous terms. The messages were often vague, open to interpretation, and layered with symbolic meaning. This ambiguity allowed for multiple readings of the same oracle, giving those who sought advice the power to interpret the message in a way that served their needs. For example, the famous prophecy of the Oracle of Delphi given to King Croesus of Lydia stated that, "If you cross the river, you will destroy a great empire." Croesus, interpreting this as a sign that he would be victorious in his campaign against Persia, was ultimately defeated, losing his empire. The ambiguity of the message could be seen as a psychological tool, one that subtly nudged those in power toward certain decisions without ever giving them clear-cut answers. This ambiguity not only kept the oracles in power but also allowed for a constant reaffirmation of the ruler's authority. By consulting the oracles and receiving cryptic responses, the rulers were given a divine justification for their actions. They were able to claim that their decisions were not based on human judgment but were instead guided by the will of the gods. This concept of divine validation provided leaders with an important psychological tool. It alleviated doubt, anxiety, and second-guessing about their decisions, as they could always point to the oracle's words as proof of divine favor. This is not unlike modern-day political leaders who use ideological frameworks or religious beliefs to justify decisions that might otherwise seem morally ambiguous or politically risky. The oracles, in this sense, can be seen as one of the earliest forms of mind control in the political sphere, manipulating the thoughts and actions of both the ruler and the public. However, the influence of the oracles extended beyond political leaders and into the everyday lives of ordinary people. Those who sought answers from the oracles often found themselves shaped by the prophecies, their lives determined by the words of a mysterious figure who was believed to hold the keys to the future. The Oracle of Delphi, in particular, attracted pilgrims from across the Greek world, many of whom came seeking answers to personal questions about marriage, family, health, and career. These individuals, too, were influenced by the authority of the oracle, which commanded a sense of reverence and trust. The power of the oracle was rooted in its perceived connection to the divine, and this connection gave the oracle a unique position of power over those who came seeking answers. The psychological impact on these individuals was profound. By placing their fate in the hands of the oracle, they surrendered a degree of control over their own lives. The oracles, through their cryptic messages, essentially created a sense of dependence. People began to shape their decisions around what the oracle had told them, trusting in the divine wisdom of the oracle even when the advice was not immediately clear or even contradictory. The idea that the future was not solely within human control, but rather in the hands of divine forces that could be accessed through the oracle, instilled a sense of helplessness and dependence. This is a key element in the psychological manipulation that oracles exerted over their followers, the sense that one's life was being guided by a higher power, and thus, there was little room for personal agency or independent thought. Moreover, the practices surrounding the oracles themselves were designed to foster an atmosphere of psychological manipulation. The environment in which the oracles operated, often in temples, remote locations, or underground sanctuaries, was intended to create an atmosphere of awe and reverence. The Temple of Delphi, for instance, was built upon a sacred site, believed to be the center of the world in ancient Greek mythology. Pilgrims who traveled to Delphi were not merely seeking answers, but were entering a sacred space where they were meant to leave their worldly concerns behind and become open to the influence of the gods. This physical space, combined with the rituals surrounding the consultation of the oracle, reinforced the idea that the answers they received were divinely sanctioned and beyond human interpretation. Rituals such as sacrifices, prayers, and offerings were made to honor the gods, and the priestesses themselves were often seen as divinely inspired figures, almost intermediaries between the mortal world and the divine. This added to the mystique of the oracles, making them figures of supreme authority. The psychological impact of these rituals cannot be understated. They were designed to heighten the emotional state of those seeking answers, allowing them to be more receptive to the oracle's messages. The Pythia, the priestess who delivered the oracle of Delphi's prophecies, often entered a trance-like state, believed to be induced by the fumes emanating from a crack in the earth beneath the temple. This state of altered consciousness, along with the symbolic gestures and ritualistic language, reinforced the idea that the oracle was accessing a divine realm of knowledge, one that transcended human understanding. The very setting and rituals surrounding the oracles heightened the belief that the words spoken were not just the product of a human intermediary, but a direct channel to the divine. The manipulation of the human psyche through oracles was not always as benign as guiding individuals towards self-discovery or clarity. There are instances in history where the oracles themselves were used as political tools, deliberately manipulated to achieve certain outcomes. The Greek historian Herodotus recounts how, during the Persian Wars, the oracle of Delphi was consulted by King Xerxes of Persia. The prophecy he received suggested that he would be victorious in his conquest of Greece, but only after much bloodshed. However, the oracle also warned of great consequences should Xerxes attack. The ambiguity of the message left room for interpretation, allowing Xerxes to choose to view it as a divine endorsement of his actions, reinforcing his belief in the inevitability of his victory. Yet, this prophecy was also seen as a psychological tool to justify his decisions. The belief that the gods were guiding his actions provided him with a psychological shield against doubt and fear, even in the face of inevitable defeat. In addition to political manipulation, the practice of consulting oracles also created a feedback loop of anxiety and anticipation. Those who sought oracular guidance often became trapped in cycles of uncertainty and second-guessing. The cryptic nature of the oracle's messages allowed for a continual reinterpretation, leading people to return again and again in search of clearer answers. This constant seeking for validation from the oracle reinforced the idea that the future was something that could not be grasped by human understanding alone, but only through divine intervention. As the individual or leader continually returned to the oracle, their reliance on the mystical power of the oracle deepened, cementing the oracle's hold over them both psychologically and emotionally. The concept of mind control through oracles did not vanish with the fall of ancient Greece and Rome. While the institutional oracles may have faded, the psychological mechanisms they employed have continued to resonate throughout history, evolving in new forms. Today, we see echoes of oracular influence in the way people seek guidance from astrology, tarot readings, and even psychology. These modern forms of divination rely on the same principles of ambiguity, interpretation, and reliance on external authority to guide personal decisions. The ancient practice of consulting oracles may no longer be commonplace, but the desire for external validation, the need for certainty in an uncertain world, and the psychological impact of submitting to an external force for guidance have all remained deeply embedded in human consciousness. Oracles, in their various forms, were not merely spiritual guides but complex instruments of psychological influence, shaping the course of individual lives and the fate of empires. Their cryptic messages, their role in legitimizing political power, and their ability to manipulate the emotions and decisions of those who sought their counsel mark them as one of history's earliest forms of mind control. In many ways, the enduring legacy of the oracles lies not just in the wisdom they supposedly offered, but in the way they wielded psychological power, shaping the thoughts, actions, and fates of those who believed in their divine authority. Their influence endures, not as an ancient relic, but as a testament to the power of belief, the manipulation of the human mind, and the timeless search for meaning in a chaotic world. The nature of oracles as a tool for controlling or shaping the decisions of individuals and societies is further complicated by the relationship between the messenger and the message. The sacred spaces where oracles were sought, particularly those located in isolated or revered areas like Delphi, were designed to foster a heightened sense of divinity and mystery. The environment itself was as much a part of the oracle's influence as the actual words spoken. The physical space surrounding the oracle, often marked by grand temples, sacred groves, or deep caverns, was crafted to prepare individuals psychologically, elevating their sense of awe and reverence, ensuring they would approach the process with the right mental state. This psychological priming played a critical role in how the messages were received and interpreted, further enhancing the oracle's control over the seeker. The concept of divine authority was inseparable from the actual process of divination. In ancient Greece and beyond, the belief in a higher power guiding human affairs was not just a religious or spiritual belief but a political and psychological strategy. It allowed leaders to justify actions that might have otherwise been deemed reckless, unethical, or disastrous. The ancient oracles, particularly the Oracle of Delphi, were sought after by rulers, military commanders, and influential figures to validate their decisions. The messages delivered by the oracle often had the power to legitimize or discredit entire military campaigns, dynastic changes, and policies. Thus, the oracle became a tool of control not just over individuals but entire nations. Through the oracle, power structures were solidified, and the idea of divine sanction for actions, particularly in war, became a means of instilling confidence in the ruler and his subjects. The psychological aspect of this manipulation was multifaceted. When a ruler or military leader consulted an oracle, they were effectively seeking confirmation that their decisions were in alignment with the divine will. The oracle's pronouncement could either validate their decisions or force them to reconsider their course of action. It was often not the specific content of the message but the implicit validation of the ruler's authority that had the most profound effect. For example, the famous consultation of the Oracle of Delphi by King Croesus of Lydia in the 6th century BC provides a revealing glimpse into this dynamic. The oracle famously told Croesus that if he attacked Persia, he would destroy a great empire. Croesus interpreted this as a sign of his impending victory and proceeded to launch an attack. However, his army was decimated, and his own empire was eventually overthrown by Persia. In this case, the oracle's words, although technically ambiguous, were interpreted by Croesus to mean divine approval, leading to his downfall. This illustrates not just the ambiguity of oracular pronouncements but also the psychological effect of relying on divine validation. The power of oracles lay in their ability to maintain a sense of mystery and uncertainty, which allowed individuals to impose their own interpretations on the divine messages. This flexibility was a key part of the psychological manipulation at play. The vagueness of oracular responses ensured that, no matter what outcome ensued, the prophecy could be retrospectively interpreted as accurate. In the case of Croesus, for instance, his defeat was later seen by some as fulfilling the prophecy. The Persian Empire, which he had hoped to destroy, could also be interpreted as the great empire in question. The adaptability of these messages meant that oracles could be employed to justify nearly any outcome, providing a sense of control and certainty to those who sought them. Another aspect of this control was the oracle's ability to influence not just the actions of individuals but also the collective mindset of societies. The dissemination of oracular messages was often done publicly, spreading their influence across entire populations. Once a prophecy was delivered, it would be reported and discussed widely, shaping public opinion and expectations. The Oracle of Delphi, for example, played a key role in the political and military decisions of Greece. The messages from Delphi were not just the private counsel of a ruler but were part of a broader cultural dialogue. These messages were frequently interpreted and discussed by priests, philosophers, and common people alike, weaving them into the very fabric of society. This shared belief in the oracle's power became a tool for maintaining social order, as it aligned the decisions of the state with a divine mandate. While oracles were often used by rulers to solidify their power, the human cost of this divine guidance was substantial. The reliance on oracles as decision-making tools often meant that the actions of entire populations were influenced by highly ambiguous and uncertain forces. In many cases, entire armies were led into battle based on cryptic prophecies, and entire communities made life-altering decisions with little understanding of what the oracle's words actually meant. In this sense, oracles became instruments of mass psychological influence, controlling not only the minds of the leaders but also the thoughts and behaviors of the masses who believed in the authority of the oracles. The psychological toll of believing in divine prediction, especially when results were negative, often led to disillusionment and frustration. This was not limited to ancient cultures alone. The persistence of oracular practices and belief in divination throughout history reflects a deeper, psychological yearning for certainty and understanding in a world that often feels chaotic and unpredictable. Even in modern times, the human tendency to seek external validation, to find meaning through mystical practices, remains pervasive. The concept of oracles, whether in the form of astrology, tarot readings, or other forms of divination, continues to offer a sense of control in an otherwise uncontrollable world. The modern appeal of these practices can be seen as an echo of the ancient relationship between the seeker and the oracle, a desire for answers to life's uncertainties and challenges. However, the concept of oracles and their control over the individual psyche also ties into the evolution of authority and power in human societies. As civilization progressed and religions evolved, the role of oracles shifted from being literal channels to the divine to symbolic representations of higher knowledge. Religious figures, such as priests, mystics, and prophets, often filled the roles once occupied by oracles. But while these figures may not have been able to deliver divine messages in the same way the Pythia did, they maintained the ability to influence public opinion and guide the actions of followers. In this way, the function of the oracle has been retained in the spiritual and religious leaders of subsequent centuries. The modern world, with its increasing skepticism toward organized religion and the rise of secularism, may no longer place stock in the ancient practices of oracles, but the underlying psychological need they addressed, seeking control, comfort, and understanding from external forces, remains as strong as ever. In this context, the oracles, despite their decline in institutional importance, represent a more profound and enduring aspect of the human experience: the need for meaning, direction, and validation from external sources. Whether through ancient prophetic rituals or contemporary belief systems, the search for knowledge beyond the limits of human perception has been an intrinsic part of the human psyche. Oracles, in their historical role, gave voice to this yearning for certainty, providing people with a channel through which they could make sense of an otherwise unknowable and unpredictable world. Furthermore, oracles were often seen as mediators between the mortal realm and the divine, bridging the gap between human uncertainty and divine wisdom. The belief in the power of oracles was rooted in the idea that humans, left to their own devices, were incapable of understanding the full scope of the universe. Oracles were believed to possess access to hidden knowledge, to truths that lay beyond the comprehension of ordinary people. In this way, the oracle's power was not just spiritual or religious, but also deeply psychological. It spoke to a fundamental human need to transcend the limitations of the self, to gain insight into the unknown, and to trust in a higher order. The psychological control exerted by oracles is evident in the way their pronouncements were woven into the very fabric of political, military, and personal life. Leaders relied on the oracles to make decisions, not only because they believed in their divine power but because they needed the validation that came with the oracle's words. The ambiguity of oracles ensured that they could be manipulated in any direction, allowing rulers to interpret them to fit their needs. In this sense, the oracle's influence was not just divine, but deeply psychological and political, as they helped shape the behavior of individuals and societies, reinforcing the power of those who had the ability to access their messages. In the end, the legacy of oracles lies not just in their ability to predict the future or provide spiritual guidance, but in the way they manipulated the psychological states of those who sought their counsel. The oracles were not just mystical figures but were instruments of power, control, and validation, providing rulers and ordinary people alike with the psychological tools to navigate the uncertainties of life. The concept of the oracle is thus more than a historical curiosity. It is a reflection of the deeper human need for meaning, certainty, and control in a world that often seems beyond comprehension. The influence of oracles in shaping historical events and the lives of those who consulted them was not limited to the divine guidance they provided but extended deeply into the realms of culture, politics, and psychology. As sacred and mystical beings, oracles held power not only because they were seen as conduits to the gods, but also because of their ability to shape societal norms and expectations. They were, in essence, social instruments, structures of belief that helped define the cultural landscape and, through their prophecies, subtly dictated the behavior of individuals, rulers, and entire nations. The oracle's role in providing divine insight was so deeply ingrained in the psyche of ancient civilizations that it became a self-sustaining system. Prophecy was not merely a matter of receiving answers from the divine but part of a greater social framework. Rulers, military leaders, and citizens alike believed that their fates were inextricably linked to the messages delivered by these mystical figures. A sense of destiny became an enduring part of public life. The reverence for oracles also served to validate the decisions of those in power. A ruler who consulted the oracle and followed its advice could claim that their actions were divinely sanctioned. This gave their decisions legitimacy and created a psychological cushion against potential failure. It was not just that the divine would guide them. They believed that through the oracle, they were actively participating in a divine narrative, where human actions, fate, and the gods were intricately woven together. One of the most powerful ways in which oracles influenced people was through their ability to shape public perception. The pronouncements of oracles were not meant to be secretive, private communications but public events. The oracle's words were disseminated, shared, and interpreted within the broader community, shaping the collective consciousness. In this way, oracles became pivotal to the social and political fabric of their societies. Leaders understood the significance of the oracle's words not just for themselves but for the morale and unity of their people. When an oracle spoke, it validated a cause, created a sense of divine purpose, and gave the people something to believe in, something greater than themselves that they could rally around. This idea of divine guidance helped solidify the power structures of ancient civilizations. In ancient Greece, for example, the Oracle of Delphi was closely tied to the Delphic Amphictyony, a league of ancient Greek states that saw itself as a protector of the oracle and its sanctity. This relationship between the oracle and the city-states created a unique symbiosis between religion and politics. The oracle's pronouncements could sway the balance of power between rival states. When war was on the horizon, a leader could approach the oracle for counsel, and the resulting message would not only justify their course of action but also potentially unify their people under the banner of divine support. The words of the oracle, then, were not only seen as prophetic but as a social contract, validating the political choices made by the ruler and ensuring that those choices had the backing of divine authority. This connection between oracles and political legitimacy extended beyond Greece. In the ancient world, many rulers sought divine favor through oracles, using them as a means to consolidate their authority and power. The use of oracles to justify military campaigns and political decisions is a key aspect of how oracles functioned within their cultural context. For instance, the Romans consulted oracles to determine the outcome of wars, the fate of political leaders, and the legitimacy of their imperial pursuits. The connection between religious practices and political power became so deeply intertwined that, by the time the Roman Empire reached its height, oracles were no longer limited to temples and shrines but had spread to the very heart of the imperial court. Roman emperors consulted oracles to ensure the success of their reigns, believing that without the endorsement of the gods, their rule would be insecure. The psychological role that oracles played in the lives of the ancient peoples should not be underestimated. In many ways, oracles functioned as a form of cognitive and emotional guidance. At times of personal crisis or collective uncertainty, the act of consulting an oracle brought structure to the chaos. The individual or community could, for a moment, feel as though the future was no longer a mysterious void, but something that could be understood through the oracle's pronouncements. This reliance on prophecy was not merely a quest for answers but an emotional and psychological coping mechanism. In a world full of uncertainty and turmoil, whether caused by war, natural disasters, or personal strife, people turned to oracles to help them make sense of the unknown. The prophecies provided a sense of security and comfort, as they suggested that there was an order to the universe, even if it was hidden from human eyes. This is why oracles, while offering cryptic advice, had such a profound effect on those who consulted them. The ambiguity of the oracle's words was, in itself, a tool for manipulation. The oracles did not provide clear answers or straightforward predictions. Instead, they spoke in riddles and symbolic language, which allowed those who consulted them to project their own hopes, fears, and desires onto the message. The interpretation of the oracle was often a deeply personal process, where the seeker would try to align the cryptic words with their own situation. This psychological dynamic made the oracle's advice far more powerful than it might appear at first glance. Because the seeker had to actively engage with the message, they were emotionally invested in its outcome. The ambiguity of the oracle's words allowed for a sense of flexibility and adaptability in the advice, creating a belief that whatever happened, it was somehow in alignment with divine will. The personal engagement with the oracle also played a role in shaping a person's sense of identity. A prophecy, even if vague or open-ended, could help individuals make sense of their lives and place within the larger cosmic narrative. For many, receiving an oracle's advice was a transformative experience that could provide them with direction and purpose. If an individual was told that they were destined for greatness, for example, they might begin to view themselves as special, as part of a divine plan. If they were given a warning, they might act with greater caution, believing that their future was shaped by forces beyond their control. In both cases, the prophecy influenced their actions and self-perception, making the oracle not just a spiritual advisor, but a psychological force that shaped the trajectory of their lives. The power of oracles extended beyond individuals and rulers. It also had a profound impact on collective identity. In times of national crisis, entire societies turned to oracles for reassurance and guidance. The Oracle of Delphi, for example, was consulted during the Persian invasions, when Greece stood on the brink of destruction. The oracle's famous prophecy that the wooden wall would save the Greeks was interpreted as a sign that the Greeks should place their hopes in their fleet of ships, which turned out to be the key to their victory. This moment illustrates how oracles played a pivotal role in shaping the collective consciousness of a society. The belief in the oracle's power to provide guidance during times of uncertainty gave people a sense of purpose and unity. It also helped to galvanize action, as people could act with the confidence that their actions were part of a larger divine plan. While the oracle's words were revered and followed by many, there were always those who questioned their validity. Skepticism existed even in ancient societies, but it was often suppressed or dismissed in favor of belief. The psychological power that oracles held was so ingrained in society that questioning their authenticity could be seen as a challenge to the very fabric of the religious and political systems that supported them. Yet, even as skepticism grew, the psychological reliance on the oracle's guidance remained strong. In times of war or political uncertainty, when the stakes were highest, people continued to turn to oracles as a way to make sense of the chaos around them. As time passed and the political and religious structures that supported the oracles began to weaken, the importance of oracles in the ancient world slowly diminished. The rise of rationalism, particularly during the Enlightenment, heralded a shift in the way people viewed divine guidance and prophecy. Oracles began to be seen as relics of a superstitious past, and their influence gradually waned. Yet, even in the face of this intellectual shift, the desire for mystical insight and divine guidance did not disappear. It simply transformed. In the centuries following the decline of the oracles, new forms of divination emerged, from astrology to tarot readings, as people continued to seek answers to the same existential questions that had driven ancient peoples to consult the oracles. The lasting influence of oracles on human history, both on a personal and collective level, cannot be overstated. They shaped the decisions of rulers and the lives of individuals, providing a psychological framework for navigating the uncertainties of life. Their power lay not just in their ability to predict the future, but in their capacity to shape belief, to give structure to chaos, and to influence the trajectory of history. Oracles were, in many ways, a psychological and social tool, a means of aligning human actions with a larger cosmic order. Even today, the echoes of their influence can be seen in the ways in which people continue to seek meaning and direction in a world that often seems unpredictable and beyond human control. As the world moved through the centuries and civilizations rose and fell, the notion of oracles continued to evolve, reflecting humanity's ongoing search for answers to existential questions. Despite the decline of traditional oracle systems like those in Delphi or the other ancient centers of divination, the core human need for guidance from the unknown, the mystical, or the divine never truly dissipated. Instead, it adapted, taking on new forms that were just as influential in shaping the course of history. Oracles, in their classical form, might have faded, but their spirit continued to haunt the collective consciousness, pushing humanity to seek higher powers or deeper understanding in different ways. In many ways, the oracles of the ancient world laid the groundwork for modern psychological, political, and spiritual practices that still persist today. The central psychological concept of a human desire for certainty in the face of the unknown is a key driving force behind the evolution of divination, prophecy, and mysticism in later eras. The ancient oracle's primary function was not just to deliver knowledge, but to act as a channel through which individuals and societies could gain reassurance that the path they were on was the right one. The future was unpredictable, and humans, from rulers to peasants, sought a way to control that unpredictability through divine insight. The story of the oracles is one of deep psychological influence. Rulers were not just seeking advice on military campaigns or personal dilemmas, but on their very identities as leaders. By consulting oracles, they connected to an ancient, divine power that validated their rule. This process of legitimization, both spiritual and political, was something that modern systems of governance and power still rely on today. Oracles provided a sense of validation, not just in the decisions they made, but in the very notion of their existence as rulers. They were the manifestation of a belief that the leader was chosen, anointed by divine forces, and given the right to guide others based on those divine edicts. This notion of divine right found expression in monarchies, empires, and even religious institutions throughout history, from the kings of Europe to the emperors of China. Yet, while oracles were deeply intertwined with political systems, their impact on personal lives should not be underestimated. In the ancient world, individuals consulted oracles not just to know the future but to find meaning in the present. The anxiety of existence, the uncertainty of the future, and the feeling of being adrift in a vast and often incomprehensible world led many to seek solace in the words of the oracles. The oracle, offering guidance and prediction, served as a source of comfort in a world that was otherwise filled with unpredictability and fear. This deeply psychological reliance on external forces for reassurance and understanding is perhaps one of the most enduring legacies of the oracle system. The transition from the classical era to the Middle Ages and beyond marked a shift in the way people interacted with the mystical and divine. Christianity, which sought to replace pagan beliefs with monotheistic doctrines, ushered in a new era of spirituality that rejected the polytheistic beliefs that had underpinned the oracle systems. But the human need for guidance, comfort, and understanding of the unknown did not vanish with the advent of Christianity. Instead, it simply transformed, taking on new forms, particularly in the development of mystical and spiritual practices. Christian saints, mystics, and visionaries became the new sources of divine insight, filling the same role as the ancient oracles, albeit under a different religious context. The process of seeking divine insight did not disappear with the rise of Christianity, but it shifted from state-sponsored oracles to personal, individualized experiences of mysticism. Saints and mystics, who were believed to have direct connections with God, became the new oracles. These figures, often living in seclusion, would have visions or divine revelations, guiding not just the rulers but the common people. In this sense, while the oracle system may have officially collapsed, the essence of seeking divine knowledge lived on in the Christian tradition. Saints like Catherine of Siena, Teresa of Avila, and Joan of Arc were not unlike the oracles of old. Their visions were seen as direct communications with the divine, offering guidance, solace, and validation for those who sought their counsel. But the shift from the classical oracle system also reflected a broader cultural shift. The move from communal, state-sanctioned practices of divination to more individualistic, private experiences of spirituality. The great public events that once surrounded oracles, pilgrimages to sacred sites, sacrifices to gods, and public pronouncements, gave way to more personal, intimate spiritual experiences. The power of mystics and saints lay in their ability to deliver personal revelations, rather than broad, societal directives. These mystics, like the oracles before them, wielded psychological influence over their followers, who turned to them for guidance, reassurance, and answers to their deepest questions. This shift is significant because it points to a changing understanding of the relationship between the divine and the human. In the time of the oracles, the divine was often seen as distant, yet accessible through intermediaries. Oracles acted as those intermediaries, often inhabiting sacred spaces like temples, caves, or groves, through which divine communication could be accessed. With the rise of Christianity, however, there was a more personal, internal shift in understanding the divine, where individuals could cultivate a relationship with God through prayer, faith, and personal revelations. This democratization of divine insight created a new era of spirituality, where the individual, rather than the state, was at the center of the quest for meaning and guidance. Despite this transformation, there was an undeniable continuity in the human need for insight into the future, even as the tools for obtaining that insight evolved. The methods of divination continued to evolve alongside society itself. In the Renaissance period, for example, the intellectual revival of interest in ancient texts and knowledge led to a resurgence of interest in astrology, alchemy, and other forms of mysticism. The Renaissance thinkers who sought to reconcile the ancient world with the emerging world of Christianity viewed the mystical arts as a means to understand the divine order of the universe. Astrology, for instance, was seen as a way to interpret the movements of the stars and planets as reflections of divine will. While the intellectual pursuit of knowledge replaced some of the more superstitious elements of divination, the underlying need to understand fate, destiny, and divine will remained a significant part of human thought. As time progressed into the modern era, the concept of oracles and divination did not entirely disappear. Although the rise of rationalism, science, and empirical methods made oracles seem irrelevant, the human fascination with the mystical continued. The late 19th and early 20th centuries saw a resurgence in interest in spiritualism, the occult, and other forms of divination. The idea that humans could tap into hidden forces of the universe, whether through tarot cards, astrology, or even mediums who claimed to communicate with the dead, reflected an ongoing desire to access knowledge beyond the limits of human perception. The psychological need for meaning, guidance, and connection to a larger cosmic order had not diminished. It had simply found new expressions in the world of modern mysticism. This resurgence of mystical practices can be seen as a direct continuation of the ancient tradition of seeking answers from forces beyond human understanding. Whether through astrology, palmistry, or tarot readings, people still seek out forms of guidance that tap into the unseen, the unknown, and the mysterious. The tools and methods may have evolved, but the underlying human need for connection with the divine, for validation of personal choices, and for understanding the hidden forces that shape our lives, remain as potent today as they were in the time of the ancient oracles. In a world increasingly dominated by science and reason, the enduring appeal of oracles and mystical practices offers a glimpse into the complexity of the human condition. The desire for certainty, control, and meaning in a world that often seems unpredictable and chaotic is timeless. The oracles of the ancient world, once regarded as the highest form of divine insight, have given way to a new form of personal mysticism, but their legacy remains intact. Through the centuries, the need to understand the forces that shape human existence and to seek answers to the big questions of life continues to drive individuals to seek out the unknown. Whether through ancient prophecies, the words of saints and mystics, or modern spiritual practices, the essence of the oracle, the desire to connect to something greater than oneself, remains a powerful and enduring force in the human psyche. As the legacy of the ancient oracles and their cryptic pronouncements continued to shape human thought and society, their influence stretched far beyond the realms of politics and warfare. The presence of oracles in ancient civilizations transcended mere divination or spiritual guidance. They became part of the very fabric of culture, identity, and psychological landscape. The ancient practice of consulting oracles was not limited to kings, generals, and rulers. Ordinary people also sought their wisdom for personal matters, including love, health, family, and fortune. The oracles became integral to the human experience, offering a sense of certainty and control in a world that often seemed unpredictable and full of uncertainty. This deeply rooted desire for understanding and reassurance, coupled with the oracle's profound ability to influence decisions, shaped the course of history in ways that are still evident today. In many ways, the oracles represented a societal contract, a pact between the mortal and the divine. This pact was not simply one of receiving divine wisdom, but of maintaining social cohesion. The messages delivered by oracles acted as a psychological anchor for societies that were often in the grip of war, political upheaval, or economic instability. In ancient Greece, for instance, the Oracle of Delphi was consulted by individuals and city-states alike to gain reassurance, to make important political decisions, or to plan military campaigns. The oracle's words became a collective point of reference, a guidepost that transcended individual desires or fears. When people consulted the oracle, they were, in a sense, engaging in a collective act of faith, submitting their own anxieties to a higher authority that, in turn, provided guidance and validation. This collective reliance on oracles as a source of divine wisdom extended beyond Greece, with oracular practices flourishing in civilizations such as Egypt, Mesopotamia, and the Roman Empire. In each of these cultures, oracles fulfilled a similar role, acting as intermediaries between the mortal world and the gods. While the methods by which oracles communicated divine wisdom varied, from dreams, visions, and sacred animals to the reading of omens and the casting of lots, the underlying purpose remained constant: to provide people with access to knowledge that could not be reached through mere human means. The oracle became a conduit through which divine will could be accessed, shaping both the present and the future. Despite the widespread belief in oracular power, the methods used to deliver prophecies remained shrouded in mystery. In some cases, the oracles themselves were believed to be in direct communion with the gods, their words delivered through a state of divine possession or trance. The Oracle of Delphi, for example, was famously delivered by the Pythia, a priestess who would enter an ecstatic state, often induced by inhaling vapors from a chasm in the earth. In this altered state of consciousness, the Pythia would speak in riddles or enigmatic phrases, which were then interpreted by the priests of the temple. This process of interpretation was critical, as it allowed the oracle's message to be shaped and molded to fit the specific circumstances of the seeker. The ambiguity of the oracle's words made them infinitely flexible, allowing for multiple interpretations and ensuring that the prophecy could always be seen as accurate, regardless of the outcome. This ambiguity, however, was not merely a result of the oracle's mystical nature. It was, in fact, a key element in the psychological influence oracles had over those who consulted them. The oracle's cryptic language, coupled with the act of interpretation, created a sense of uncertainty that worked to the advantage of those in power. Political leaders and military commanders often turned to the oracles not only for divine guidance but for validation of their decisions. The very vagueness of the oracle's responses allowed those in power to interpret the prophecies as they saw fit, providing them with the psychological comfort that their decisions were in alignment with divine will. For example, the story of King Croesus of Lydia's consultation with the Oracle of Delphi offers a profound example of how the ambiguity of oracles could lead to catastrophic consequences. When Croesus asked the oracle if he should go to war with Persia, the oracle famously responded, "If you cross the river, you will destroy a great empire." Croesus interpreted this as a sign of victory and proceeded to launch a military campaign against Persia. However, the prophecy was not as straightforward as it seemed. Croesus's attack resulted in his defeat, and the great empire destroyed was his own. The oracle's words, though seemingly a confirmation of Croesus's actions, were vague enough to allow for a tragic interpretation, highlighting how the ambiguous nature of oracular responses could lead to dangerous self-deception. This psychological manipulation was not limited to the rulers who consulted the oracles. It also extended to the common people who sought answers to their personal problems. The oracle's role in everyday life was no less influential, as individuals turned to these sacred figures to make decisions about everything from marriage to health, family to career. The oracle became a source of authority, and its words were often interpreted as divine instructions, leaving individuals feeling a sense of duty to follow them. The result was a deep psychological bond between the individual and the oracle, Seeking out the oracle was not simply an act of curiosity but a deeply ingrained cultural practice, a way to confront the unknown with the assurance that one's decisions were guided by higher forces. The belief in the oracle's power was so profound that it often became intertwined with the very identity of the seeker. For rulers, consulting the oracle was not merely an act of strategic planning. It was a way of aligning themselves with the divine. The very act of seeking divine guidance, of presenting oneself to the oracle, reinforced the ruler's role as the chosen leader, the one who had the god's favor and protection. This connection between divine favor and leadership was essential for maintaining authority. For common people, consulting the oracle was a way to navigate the uncertainties of life, to seek guidance on matters that were beyond their control. The messages from the oracle offered comfort and assurance, creating a sense of direction in the midst of life's chaos. In the context of ancient Greece, the role of oracles was also integral to the functioning of religion and the broader social fabric. The gods and goddesses of ancient Greece were seen not only as protectors and benefactors, but also as powerful forces that could shape human lives. The oracle's messages, which were believed to come directly from the gods, helped to maintain the connection between the divine and the mortal realms. In this sense, oracles played a vital role in the religious practices of the time, ensuring that the God's will was communicated to the people. Religious rituals, sacrifices, and offerings were performed to honor the gods and seek their favor, and the oracle served as the intermediary that ensured the people's actions were in accordance with divine expectations. The psychological importance of the oracles cannot be overstated. The power of the oracle lay not just in its ability to predict the future but in its capacity to shape the way people thought about themselves, their decisions, and their relationships with the divine. The very act of consulting the oracle reinforced a sense of dependency on external forces. People believed that their lives were not entirely within their control but were guided by greater, unseen powers. This belief provided comfort and reassurance, but it also fostered a sense of helplessness. The oracle's pronouncements often carried with them a sense of inevitability, a belief that the future was predetermined and that human actions were part of a greater cosmic plan. While oracles served as guides to the future, they also played a role in shaping the past. The interpretation of oracular pronouncements was often influenced by the events that followed. If a prophecy was fulfilled, it was seen as proof of the oracle's power and divine insight. If it was not fulfilled, it was often reinterpreted or explained away. The oracle's ability to shape the narrative of events, to make sense of the past through divine guidance, created a psychological framework that allowed people to make sense of their world. The ambiguous nature of oracles allowed them to fit into a variety of historical contexts, giving them an enduring power over the human imagination. Even as the ancient oracle systems began to decline, their influence continued to resonate through history. The psychological mechanisms that oracles employed, ambiguity, validation, and divine authority, persisted in the forms of religious leaders, mystics, and prophets who followed in their wake. The practice of seeking guidance from higher powers, whether through prayer, meditation, or spiritual guidance, continued long after the temples of Delphi had fallen silent. The desire for certainty, for reassurance, for meaning, remained a constant in human history as people sought answers to life's deepest questions. The oracles, in their cryptic wisdom and divine authority, represented humanity's enduring search for truth, purpose, and connection to something greater than themselves. In a way, the oracles did not fade into the past. Their legacy lives on in the spiritual practices, psychological rituals, and belief systems of the modern world. Whether in the form of astrology, tarot readings, or mystical experiences, the human need to seek guidance from forces beyond the material world remains as strong as ever. The ancient practice of consulting oracles, in all its mystery and complexity, continues to shape how we understand fate, destiny, and the divine in the modern era. Even today, as we navigate an increasingly uncertain world, the longing for divine insight and the comfort of knowing that our lives are part of a larger cosmic plan remains deeply ingrained in the human psyche. As civilizations evolved and transformed over time, the practice of oracular consultation and the belief in divine intervention continued to influence not only political and social structures, but also individual psychological landscapes. While the grand temples of Delphi and the sacred groves of ancient oracles might have eventually faded, their legacy persisted in more subtle forms. The decline of the ancient oracle systems did not signify the end of humanity's quest for understanding or divine guidance. Instead, it marked a shift in how that guidance was sought, interpreted, and integrated into the daily lives of individuals and societies. The oracle's power was never just in the predictions they offered, but in the deeper psychological and cultural functions they fulfilled, functions that would find new expressions in the centuries that followed. One of the key aspects of oracles was their ability to frame life's uncertainties within a larger, cosmic narrative. Whether it was the mysterious Pythia at Delphi, the oracle at Dodona, or the sacred rites of Egypt's temples, these practices were more than just about the future, they were about shaping the present. The ancient world was filled with constant turmoil, war, famine, and unpredictable political shifts. In this context, oracles provided a sense of order and meaning. When individuals or entire nations faced grave decisions, whether going to war, engaging in trade, or making sacrifices, consulting an oracle was a way to bring some semblance of certainty to the chaos. The belief that the gods were watching over and guiding decisions helped to alleviate fear and doubt. It created a shared understanding that life's twists and turns were not entirely random, that there was some divine logic behind the challenges humanity faced. This sense of cosmic reassurance was not merely about predicting the future, but about providing individuals with the psychological tools to navigate the unknown. In seeking the oracle's counsel, people were, in a sense, offloading their anxieties onto something greater than themselves. This psychological process of externalizing uncertainty was powerful. People believed they could not solve life's great questions alone, and through the oracle, they sought connection to a higher authority that would guide their actions. It was this belief that sustained the appeal of oracles for centuries, long after their official role in religious and political affairs had diminished. But what was it about these oracular practices that created such a deep psychological imprint on the minds of ancient people? The key lies in the way these rituals were framed. When a person or ruler approached an oracle, they were not just seeking advice or an answer, they were engaging in a sacred ritual. The oracle and the process of consulting it were intertwined with religious practices. Often, there were elaborate preparations, rituals of purification, offerings to the gods, and journeys to sacred sites. These steps heightened the sense of importance and reverence surrounding the consultation. The environment was designed to heighten the emotional and psychological experience, drawing the seeker into a space where the divine seemed not just possible, but inevitable. The act of seeking wisdom from the oracle, therefore, became an immersive experience that went beyond the mundane. It was an encounter with the divine. This sense of divine engagement provided people with a psychological buffer against the harshness of reality. The oracles gave voice to the gods, who were believed to act with a wisdom that transcended human understanding. This connection to the divine provided those who sought it with the emotional security of knowing they were not alone in their decisions. The psychological comfort offered by oracles was particularly important in times of crisis. When rulers faced military threats or internal instability, the oracle's words could offer reassurance that their actions were guided by higher forces. It provided not only spiritual solace but also political and social stability, as people rallied behind decisions that were seen as divinely sanctioned. As the ancient world transitioned into the Middle Ages, the decline of polytheistic belief systems did not end the human reliance on oracles, but it did transform the way people sought divine guidance. The rise of Christianity marked a significant shift in the ways in which the divine was understood. Christianity rejected many of the pagan practices associated with divination and prophecy, viewing them as contrary to the will of God. However, the psychological need for divine insight did not vanish. Instead, it evolved. Rather than seeking guidance from temples or oracles, people began turning to Christian saints, mystics, and visionaries, figures who were seen as intermediaries between the human world and the divine. The mystical experiences of saints and religious leaders became the new form of oracular wisdom. The belief that certain individuals were capable of receiving direct revelations from God fulfilled the same psychological function as the ancient oracles. Just as people once consulted the oracle to confirm their decisions, to gain insight into the future, or to seek reassurance, they now looked to the saints and mystics for similar guidance. These figures, whether they were visionaries like Saint Teresa of Avila, the politically powerful Joan of Arc, or the widely respected Saint Catherine of Siena, became conduits of divine will. Their mystical visions and revelations were believed to have the same power as the words of ancient oracles, guiding individuals, communities, and even entire nations. Yet, even as the Christian world took hold, the psychological need for direct, divine insight remained ever present. In a world where the material and the spiritual were seen as intertwined, the human drive for spiritual connection, whether through oracles, saints, or mystics, never fully disappeared. What changed was the context in which that connection occurred. Christianity provided its followers with a more structured framework for divine guidance, one that focused on scripture, prayer, and religious doctrine. The role of mystics and visionaries, while still significant, became more individualized and internalized. People still sought guidance, but it was now more personal and less dependent on the public, ritualistic practices of oracular consultation. The 19th and 20th centuries saw a resurgence of interest in mystical practices as Europe and the Western world grappled with the uncertainties and upheavals of industrialization, scientific advancement, and 2 world wars. The Enlightenment and the rise of rationalism had pushed many forms of divination and mysticism into the margins of society. But during times of deep societal and personal crisis, people sought new ways of interpreting the unknown. The mystical, spiritual, and occult practices of the 19th century, including seances, spiritualism, astrology, and the growing popularity of theosophy, mirrored ancient oracular practices in many ways. These systems offered people a way to understand a world that was increasingly perceived as fragmented and impersonal. Just as the ancients had consulted oracles in times of distress, so too did people in the modern era turn to mysticism as a means of seeking answers to life's deep questions. The appeal of oracles and mystical practices, even in modern times, is rooted in a deeply psychological impulse. The need for certainty in the face of uncertainty is a universal human experience, transcending time, culture, and religion. The ancient oracles offered a way to address this need by providing answers that were seen as divinely sanctioned. Today, people continue to seek guidance from various forms of divination, whether it be through astrology, tarot readings, or even modern-day mystics, because they are still driven by the same desire to find meaning and order in a world that often seems unpredictable and overwhelming. In the context of modern life, the significance of oracles and divination may appear diminished, yet the human need for spiritual guidance and existential certainty remains as strong as ever. Whether through more structured religious practices or through more individualized forms of mysticism, the quest for answers to life's great questions continues to shape the collective human experience. Oracles, in their many forms, have left an indelible mark on human history, not only through their role in guiding the decisions of rulers and individuals, but through their psychological impact on the human psyche. The legacy of the oracle is a testament to the enduring human desire to connect with something greater than ourselves, to seek guidance from forces beyond our understanding, and to find meaning in a world that often seems uncertain and beyond control. The psychological mechanisms that made oracles such a powerful tool in the ancient world are still at play today, in various forms of spirituality, mysticism, and personal guidance systems. As societies continue to evolve, the need to seek out higher knowledge, to access divine wisdom, and to gain a sense of reassurance in an uncertain world will remain a driving force in human life, ensuring that the legacy of the oracles lives on in a modern world that still grapples with many of the same existential questions. The role of oracles in the ancient world was not merely limited to providing divine guidance or insight into the future. It was a deeply interwoven element of the fabric of ancient societies, serving not only as a spiritual tool but also as a psychological and political one. As ancient civilizations matured and became more complex, the idea of oracles began to take on increasingly important roles that extended far beyond simple fortune-telling or spiritual inquiry. These oracles became gateways to understanding the unknown, offering a sense of control over the unpredictable aspects of life, death, fate, and power. As such, oracles shaped the mindset and decisions of those who sought them, creating a powerful force that echoed across history, often determining the fate of entire kingdoms, empires, and individuals. The psychological significance of oracles lay in their ability to transcend the limitations of human understanding. In a world filled with uncertainty, war, political instability, and constant change, the oracles offered a way to confront these existential fears and uncertainties by providing answers or, at the very least, a sense of direction. This psychological comfort stemmed not only from the perceived divine authority of the oracles but also from the belief that these oracles were somehow tethered to a greater cosmic order. The notion that the gods or supernatural forces governed the world and could provide access to their will was a deeply embedded cultural assumption. People turned to oracles for not just answers but for a sense of divine legitimacy and reassurance, particularly in moments of profound uncertainty or when critical decisions needed to be made. The complexity of oracular consultation, from the specific rituals to the enigmatic language used in prophecy, allowed them to fulfill psychological functions far beyond mere prediction. In many ways, the ambiguity of oracle responses played a key role in their power. An oracle's prophecy, often delivered in riddles or metaphorical language, was never a simple, straightforward answer. This ambiguity created a sense of mystery that not only added to the reverence surrounding the oracle but also allowed for multiple interpretations. This flexibility meant that prophecies could be adapted to fit different circumstances, ensuring that people could continue to derive meaning from them, regardless of the outcome. When things went wrong, the prophecy could often be reinterpreted or explained away, creating a resilient structure where the divine insight seemed never to fail. Moreover, oracles were not just about personal revelation but were deeply integrated into the larger social, political, and religious systems. The role of oracles in statecraft, particularly in the ancient world, was critical. Leaders and rulers consulted oracles before embarking on wars, establishing alliances, or making decisions that could impact the entire population. The divine approval, it seemed, could legitimize the most dangerous decisions or confirm the righteous path. A ruler who consulted an oracle could present their actions as being backed by divine will, insulating themselves from the consequences of their decisions. In a sense, the oracle became not just a guide but also a means of safeguarding a ruler's political and military authority. If a campaign failed, the oracle's ambiguous pronouncements were often reinterpreted to suggest that the failure was part of the divine plan, that it was a test of faith, or that some unforeseen consequence had altered the course of destiny. This link between oracles and political power was deeply psychological. A ruler who believed that they had the god's favor, and who had consulted an oracle to confirm it, was able to carry out decisions with a greater sense of confidence. This confidence, in turn, had a ripple effect throughout society. If the people believed that their ruler was acting with divine sanction, they were more likely to support the ruler's actions, regardless of how risky or dangerous those actions appeared. This created a psychological feedback loop where divine authority reinforced political authority, and political power, in turn, legitimized the oracle's influence. It was a mutually beneficial relationship. Oracles gained prestige by advising powerful rulers, while rulers maintained power by appealing to the divine. The psychological influence of oracles extended not only to kings and generals but also to the general populace. Even in societies where oracles were not directly involved in political decision-making, they still played a profound role in everyday life. Ordinary people turned to oracles for guidance in matters of health, love, family, and fortune. The oracle provided a framework within which personal and existential anxieties could be addressed. The questions people asked oracles were not necessarily grand or world-changing. They were often deeply personal, focused on immediate concerns that affected their day-to-day existence. And yet, the act of consulting the oracle, of receiving a response, however ambiguous, brought a sense of clarity. The oracle gave people a psychological crutch, providing a sense of certainty, however illusory, in an often unstable and chaotic world. These consultations were not one-off events. People often returned to oracles time and again, forming a relationship of sorts with the divine forces they believed the oracle represented. Over time, this relationship could grow more intimate, with individuals becoming more reliant on the oracle's wisdom to make decisions. The act of consulting the oracle became a ritual, a sacred practice that reinforced the idea that the answers to life's questions were beyond human understanding, requiring divine insight. Whether the prophecies were clear or cryptic, the mere act of seeking guidance allowed individuals to feel as though they were part of a larger, divine narrative. But this system of divination also carried with it its own dangers. While oracles offered comfort and guidance, they could also entrap individuals in cycles of dependency. The more an individual relied on oracles, the more they began to see themselves as powerless in the face of fate. This dynamic reflected a broader psychological condition in human societies, the desire to relinquish control, to surrender personal agency to forces greater than oneself. In many ways, this relinquishment of control was tied to the perceived power of the oracle. By seeking an oracle's counsel, individuals transferred responsibility for their choices to a higher authority, absolving themselves of the burden of decision-making. This psychological transfer of responsibility was comforting, but it also made people more susceptible to manipulation and control. The complexity and intricacy of oracular rituals created an emotional and psychological environment where people were emotionally invested in the outcome. The rituals themselves were often long and involved, designed to put the seeker in a heightened emotional and psychological state. The atmosphere of mystery, the sacred nature of the space, the words of the oracle. All of these factors combined to create an intense emotional experience that reinforced the psychological power of the oracle. People who sought oracles were often deeply invested in the outcome, and their emotional attachment to the process could cloud their judgment. This emotional vulnerability made it easier for oracles to maintain their influence. The oracle's pronouncements, whether they were positive or negative, took on an almost absolute importance in the lives of those who consulted them. While the ancient oracles were integral to the political and religious systems of their time, their psychological impact was no less significant. The very act of consulting an oracle became a way for individuals and communities to navigate the complexities of the human condition. In seeking the oracle's counsel, they sought a sense of connection to something greater than themselves, a way of understanding their place in the universe. In doing so, they created a framework for coping with the uncertainties of life, a framework that transcended logic, reason, and material concerns. The oracles offered not just answers but a way of framing the world itself, providing individuals with the tools to make sense of their lives. In the centuries that followed, as the influence of the ancient oracles waned, the psychological need for divine guidance and validation did not disappear. Instead, it found new forms of expression in religious, mystical, and spiritual practices. The human need to seek reassurance, to know that one's actions were aligned with a greater cosmic order, continued to shape human behavior. The legacy of the oracles lived on in the various forms of divination, mysticism, and prophecy that emerged over the centuries, from astrology and tarot readings to the rise of spiritualism in the 19th century. These practices, while differing in methodology, were all rooted in the same psychological needs that the ancient oracles had fulfilled. The need to feel connected to a higher power, the need to understand the mysteries of life, and the need to gain reassurance in an unpredictable world. Today, while oracles may no longer hold the same political or religious significance, their psychological legacy endures. The human drive to seek guidance from external sources, whether through religion, mysticism, or even modern forms of therapy, remains as powerful as ever. The oracles may have faded from the world's stage, but their influence persists in the ways we seek meaning, purpose, and direction in our lives. The same forces that drove people to consult the oracles in the ancient world still shape our collective consciousness today, revealing a fundamental truth about the human condition. The search for meaning, guidance, and understanding is as timeless as it is universal.